our website, booktv.org.
And now, political commentator Cokie Roberts joins us live for In Depth. She'll answer your questions about her books, which include her most recent, Capital Dames, published this past April, Ladies of Liberty, Founding Mothers, and more.
Mary Martha Corinne Morrison Claiborne Boggs Roberts. Where did Cokie come from?
My brother Tommy was 3 years older than me, and when I came home from the hospital, a mere almost 72 years ago, he couldn't say Corinne, and he christened me Cokie, and I've been Cokie ever since.
You write in your book, From This Day Forward, co-authored with Steve Roberts, I'm the youngest child of an insane family.
Well, I said that to him when we were first meeting each other. It was at a student political meeting in Ohio in 1962, the summer between our sophomore and junior years of college. And we were writing notes back and forth to each other during some very important plenary session or whatever, students do. And he had something, sort of typically 19-year-old boy pompous. And I wrote back, I'm the youngest child of an insane family.
Who are the Boggs?
Well, my family is actually a wonderful family. My father and mother are some of the most dedicated public servants, really, in the history of the country. And my father, Hale Boggs, was elected to Congress in 1940, before I was born. He was 26 years old. My mother was 24. They had a baby girl at the day of his election, and 8 days later, a baby boy. And they came here, and I think about it now, in my old age, and think about these kids coming to Washington. I mean, in this day and age, they'd still be on their parents' health insurance. And there they were, the member of Congress and his wife. But of course, they weren't kids in that era. They were plenty grown-up people. But here they were. It was pre-World War II Washington. And according to my mother's account, it was very similar to the periods of Washington that I write about in my history books. You had to go calling, and the women were expected to call on, I'll get the days wrong, but the cabinet wives on Monday, the Senate on Tuesday, the House on Wednesday, the Supreme Court on Thursday, and receive on Friday. And it was very formal and very organized. And Mama told the story of the first day she had to go calling, and here she was, this very young woman, new to Washington, and they were living in an apartment building on Connecticut Avenue, and the horn honks, and she goes running downstairs to get in the car to go calling, and it was Lady Bird Johnson and Pauline Gore driving her, and of course they became quite a fearsome group, that group of women.
What happened on October 16th, 1972?
On October 16th, 1972, my father, who by that time was Majority Leader of the House of Representatives, in a spirit that was very typical of him, went to campaign for a freshman member of Congress in Alaska, Nick Begich. And it had been a very tiring session up until that point. He was exhausted, but he had made a promise and he was going to keep it. And they took off in a small plane from Anchorage, Alaska, headed for Juneau, and the plane disappeared and to this day has never been found.
Where were you on that day?
I lived in California at the time. I was a young mom. I had a couple of kids. I had a child who had just turned 2, and my little boy turned 4 while I was in Alaska looking for my father.
Lindy Boggs.
My mother we lost her last year, but she was an absolutely, or 2 years ago, absolutely remarkable human being. A day does not go by without someone coming up to me and telling me something else my fabulous mother did. She was from a long line of politicians. In fact, just recently, Steve Hess here at the Brookings Institution has come out with a reprint of his 50-year-old book, America's Political Dynasties, and realized that my mother's family, the Claibornes, were actually after the Roosevelts, the second most political family in terms of office and all of that. And she came out of that long line of public servants. And of course, when she married my father in, I guess, 1937, women weren't going into office. But then when my father was killed, his plane disappeared, she ran for his seat in a special election in March of 1973 and served until she decided not to run again in 1990. She made that decision because my sister was dying at the time. But then she, as I always joke, she discovered retirement was very hard work because everyone asked her to do everything, and she didn't have an excuse to say no. So at the age of 81, she took a new job offered to her by President Clinton as the ambassador to the Vatican. And that was a wonderful, wonderful experience for her.
You write in your book, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, that her friends and she was a little fearful of taking the seat because she would lose influence, in a sense.
Well, that was interesting because as a political wife, she had a tremendous amount of influence. She and people like Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Ford, the rest of them, they were quite a cohort, and they really ran everything. They ran the political conventions, they ran voter registration drives, they ran their husbands' offices, they of course ran us kids, and it was before Home Rule when they first started out in Washington, so they worked with the African American women here in Washington to run all of the social services, family and child services, and all of those kinds of things. And so they were a powerful group of women. And of course, one of the things that my mother's power stemmed from was that people were never quite sure where she stood. She made them always think that she was with them, because she didn't actually have to vote. And my sister said to her, you know, Mom, what you're going to hate about being in Congress is voting, because there is no maybe button. You have to actually declare yourself yes or no. But she ended up being a very powerful member of Congress.
You also write about the fact that she went to get a loan for a condo in downtown Washington.
Well, after she went to Congress, I mean, this is one of the things that's very true. As you know, Peter, being up here, seeing it to this day, women in Congress find that they not only represent their districts or their states if they're in the Senate, but they represent the women of America. And women come to them with all kinds of issues and problems that they do not come to the male members of Congress with. And one of the things that became very clear was that women lost their credit when they lost their husbands, and either because the husband died or he took off with some chippy. And so my mother went to Congress in March of '73, as I said, and went on to the Banking Committee, and they were considering a bill to end discrimination in lending, and it said on the basis of race, creed, or national origin. And as Mama told the story, she just went into the back room and wrote in longhand, or sex or marital status, and Xeroxed it and brought it in to the members of the committee and said in her very polite Southern way, "Oh, I'm sure that my colleagues just omitted this by accident." And that, of course, is how women got credit. And then years later, several years later, not that many years later, we bought her house, the house that I grew up in, where I still live. And she was moving to downtown Washington into a condominium and was having trouble with a loan. And she called the bank and said, you know, I find since my income and assets are a matter of public record as a member of Congress, she said, I find it passing strange that I'm having difficulty with this loan. And as the author of the Equal Credit Act, I'm worried that this is because I am female and elderly, and she had her loan that afternoon.
Well, let's take a quick look at Lindy Boggs.
It's my great honor to welcome you to this joint meeting in commemoration of the 200th anniversary of Congress. This occasion is a very special part of the bicentennial observances of the Congress, which will be marked by historical publications, ceremonies, exhibits, a special film, and other activities during 1989. All three branches of the federal government trace their beginnings to 1789, but it was the Congress which assembled first and successfully launched the United States of America.
Well, my mother was a great historian, and she's the person who really imbued a love of history in me. And she was the chairman of that bicentennial of Congress. She had been chairman of several bicentennials along the way. My sister said to her, you know, Mom, this is a great gig. Everything's likely to turn 200 at some point. But she particularly, of course, appreciated that one. As I said, many members of her family had been in Congress. And they then assembled in Independence Hall, of course, where the Constitution was written and all of that, and establishing the Congress. And she was the person who was assigned to preside over it. So she sat in that big chair of George Washington's with the half moon on the sun on the back, and her feet didn't touch the floor.
You've referred to your sister a couple times. Who is Barbara?
My sister Barbara Boggs-Sigmund was a really incredibly intelligent and humorous and beautiful and delightful human being. She was a politician. She was in local politics in New Jersey for many, many years, ending up as the mayor of Princeton, New Jersey. And she died of cancer at age 51.
And you also had a brother, Tom.
My brother, Tom, was a very prominent lawyer in Washington and lobbyist, and he was really a very, again, very smart, very funny, very affable, hail fellow, well-met, well-known person in Washington. Again, someone who was incredibly generous with his time and his talents and his treasure, and he died last year.
From your book, We Are Our Mother's Daughters. As children, my brother and sister and I thought of people like Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson, Hubert Humphrey, and Gerald Ford as family friends who would come by for a casual dinner picked from the vegetable garden.
That's true. That was one of the great benefits of our lives. Barbara and Tommy both always said, you know, we might not have had the kind of money that some of the people we knew had growing up in Washington, but we had treasure well beyond anything that you could put in a bank.
Cokie Roberts, is Washington still like it was back then?
Not even close. It's tragically different. I had the incredible honor a couple of years ago, several years ago now, to be asked by Betty Ford to be one of the eulogists at her funeral. And I always joked that I would have been scared to death, except Mrs. Ford told me exactly what she wanted me to say, which is she wanted me to talk about the Washington of that era, when everybody was friends. And Jerry Ford and Betty Ford and my parents were very good friends. And President Ford said to me in my last interview with him, he said, you know, I don't understand what's going on in Washington now. And that was well before it was as bad as it is now. And he said, you know, when your dad and I were majority leader and minority leader of the House, we'd have big debates, but then we'd still be very good friends. And he said, for heaven's sakes, Cokie, they were partisan. We were the leaders of our parties in the House. But then the debate would be over and we'd sit down together and be good friends. And they were quite good friends. And Susan Ford and I are still good friends.
We are our mother's daughters. Let's take a moment here to explain what the woman's vote is and what it is not. It is not a vote based on abortion or other so-called women's issues. All of our polling tells us that men and women vote exactly the same on those questions. The women's vote is an economic vote.
Well, most votes are an economic vote, but it's certainly true about the women's vote. the women still feel themselves economically more vulnerable than men, because they are. It's a correct perception. And there is still the last hired, first fired phenomenon. But women also have a very different relationship with the role of government. That is not to say that women love government, but they hate government less than men hate government. and that's for, you know, when you think about it, Peter, it's for very understandable reasons. You think about who are the major beneficiaries of the biggest government program, Medicare and Social Security. Women, because we wish you guys lived longer, but you don't. And who are the people taking care of people on those programs? Women. And who are the people who are on welfare? Women with children, unwed, you know, unmarried women with children. Whose food stamps? All of those things. You go down government programs, and the recipients are either elderly women or younger women and children. And who works for government? And who works in all kinds of governmentally funded institutions like arts councils or libraries or hospitals in many cases. It's women. So there's a different attitude about government, and that's what women bring to the voting booth.
One good example, gun control. Women see this as a mommy issue. No machine guns on playgrounds? Good idea. The ban on assault weapons would never have passed Congress had there been fewer women in 1993. Only 23% of Republican men voted for it, but 67% of Republican women did.
Yeah, and then it expired and it was never renewed. But you're seeing, of course, me very salient right now, and there's no accident that Hillary Clinton is talking a lot about guns and gun control, and a lot of it is to appeal to women.
Cokie Roberts, a lot of your history books, all of your history books are focused on women.
Yes.
Where'd you get the idea?
Well, it's not like there aren't history books about men. There are a lot of those. But the first one that I wrote was Founding Mothers, about the women of the founding period. Really, I got the idea from the women I was just talking to you about, the women of my growing up years who were so influential in Washington and in government. And you know, as somebody who has covered Congress and politics as long as I have, you spend an enormous amount of time with the Founding Fathers. You know, they're invoked all the time, as you well know. You know, the founders said this about that. And almost, by the way, almost always, I'd say about 99.9% of the time that somebody in Congress invokes the Founding Father about something, it's wrong. So I felt a tremendous need, I continue to feel a tremendous need to go back and read what they actually said about the right to bear arms, or religion in the public square, or why you have to be born in America to be president, although apparently Canada works. So I started wondering about the women of this incredibly important, crucial period of our history, and figured they had to be at least as influential as the women of my period. And when I went back to learn about them, I really had a hard time. It was very, very difficult to find out what they were up to, because there was so little by way of letters and diaries and records, with the exception of Abigail Adams, who thankfully wrote and wrote and wrote, and her family who saved her letters. The rest of them were really hard to piece together.
Well, you lament in the introduction, I think, to Ladies of Liberty that Martha Washington burned all her letters.
Martha Washington, in fact, just today I was reading a review of a new book about Martha and George, and it highlighted this fact that it's she's elusive, because she has burned her own letters and his to her. So what we have is just little snippets of their relationship, and then letters from other people about them that you're able to piece together. And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has done a very fine job of trying to find everything they can to try to flesh out a portrait of Martha Washington.
Good afternoon and welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our in-depth program. Once a month, we invite an author on to talk about his or her body of work. This month, it's political journalist and commentator Cokie Roberts. She's written several books, many history books, a couple of autobiographical books as well. If you'd like to participate in our conversation this afternoon, there are several ways of doing it. We're going to put the phone numbers up on the screen. 202 is the area code, 202-748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. You can also send Cokie Roberts a text message. Now, this is only for texts. Please don't call this number, but if you want to send a text, 202-717-9684 is that number to call. Now, if you can't get through on the phone lines, you want to make a comment, try social media. Email booktv@cspan.org. Twitter, @booktv is our Twitter handle. And finally, you can leave a comment on Facebook, facebook.com/booktv. You'll see a promotion there with Cokie Roberts speaking. Just make a comment underneath that, and we will find that comment. And we'll begin taking those calls in just a minute. Cokie Roberts, who is Steve Rogow?
Well, Steve, his birth certificate did say Rogo. They pronounced it, which is one of the reasons they changed it. When he was 2, his father changed their name to Roberts. But Steve and I met in the summer of 1962. He was at Harvard. I was at Wellesley, and we were at a National Student Association meeting at the University of Ohio in Columbus, and I had actually met his twin brother, Mark, before that in Boston, and I kind of looked across the campus and I saw this guy who looked like Mark Roberts, but he didn't look exactly like Mark Roberts, and then I went up. We all had name tags on, so I went up and I looked at his name tag, and I said, "So are you Mark Roberts' brother?" And he looked at my name tag and said, "Are you Barbara Boggs' sister?" So that's how we met. And we started dating sort of off and on then, and then more seriously later, and then married in 1966.
And he was several years with the New York Times.
He was at the New York Times for 25 years. And he went to the Times right after college. He had the wonderful experience of being an intern or assistant, whatever they called it, for Scotty Reston, James Reston, who at that point was the most powerful journalist in Washington, the columnist for the New York Times and longtime bureau chief in Washington for the New York Times. And Scotty was a wonderful mentor and a really kind advisor. And so he made sure that after the year was up that the New York Times hired Steve on the city staff, and so he moved to New York, and then we went to California with the Times, and then to Athens, Greece, and then came back here, and he was in the Washington Bureau for many years.
I think it was your mother-in-law who described you as the best Jew in the family.
Well, that was not a heavy competition. It was, but that is true.
But you're Catholic.
I am a very serious Catholic. But we are about to enter this. In fact, tonight is the first night of Hanukkah, and we are about to enter the very busy season.
So why did your mother-in-law describe you as the best Jew in the family?
Well, when Steve and I were dating as a Catholic-Jewish couple, that was very unusual in that day and age. It's not at all anymore, but at that time it was. And I think it was very difficult for Steve's parents. They had not really had the experience of having non-Jewish friends, and they were very concerned about what it would mean for him to marry outside of the tribe. And so it was a difficult courtship. And finally, we convinced them that we really would not only honor them and love them, but also their religion. And for me, the only way to really embrace Judaism was to know about the religion. For them, it was much more of a cultural phenomenon than a religious one. But so I started being serious about learning about Judaism and about celebrating certainly the holidays. And in fact, at one point, Steve's mother joked, Steve joked to me. He said, "My mother was right. I should have married a Jewish girl. She wouldn't have made me go to temple on the high holidays."
Well, you and Steve Roberts have written 2 books together, From This Day Forward and Haggadah.
Our Haggadah, right.
What is Haggadah?
Our Haggadah is the service that is read at Passover. And it's a ritualistic liturgy. And so we have had Passover for close to 50 years. And years and years and years ago, I wrote a little version of the Haggadah because our first Passover that we had I had bought a version of it, and everybody who came had arguments about it. It doesn't have what I like about this. It's too preachy about that. Whatever. And so I got a bunch of Haggadahs together and sat down and typed up a version, which we still use. But at one point, the publisher came to us and said, why don't you actually put it between hardcovers? And so we did, and along with a lot of commentary and introductions talking about the way that Passover and Easter are connected and all of that. So it was a very interesting exercise.
In From This Day Forward, Cokie Roberts, you write about how Steve Roberts got you your first job.
Not my first job, but my job at NPR.
That's it.
Right. So no, my first job I actually got through the college placement office of all things, but it was a wonderful job with a production company here in Washington that's still operating, Altman Productions. And in fact, with them, after I was working for them for about a year, we put a program on the air here in Washington called Meeting of the Minds, where I was the anchor. I was 21 years old, and it was the lead-in to Meet the Press. And so I found myself, sort of going full cycle to come back around on a Sunday morning. But Steve and I then, when we got married, never even had a conversation about my staying with my very good job. We just assumed that I would quit it and move to New York, and where he was working, and so I did. But then we moved to, I worked there. We moved to California. I had jobs there. We moved to Greece. I worked there, and then we came back to Washington, and that's when Steve helped me get this job. It was at NPR.
Cokie Roberts, Linda Wertheimer, Nina Totenberg.
Right. Well, it was we are very, very good friends, and we have had each other's backs for a very long time. But they are the people who got me that job. What happened was Steve went to work at the New York Times bureau, and he was sitting at a desk, and next to him was someone he didn't know, and she was a woman who introduced herself as Judith Miller, who has since become famous. And he said, "Where did you come from?" And she said, "Well, I've just come over from NPR." And he said, "What's NPR?" And she told him, and he said, "That sounds like a perfect place for my wife," because I had been doing a lot of radio reporting for CBS from Athens. And so she said, "Well, call Nina Totenberg." So Steve called Nina, and Nina said, "Get me her resume." So Steve delivered my resume to Nina, and as they say, the rest is history.
We are our mother's daughters. The debate over the role of women has created enormous upheaval for society and for the family. For women like me, who grew up and graduated from college before the revolution, it's all gotten a little exhausting.
It's true. I was interviewing Gloria Steinem the other day about her new book, On the Road, and Life on the Road. And I said to her, "Aren't you just worn out?" And she's not, God love her. I mean, she is really ready to keep going. But it does get exhausting because you feel like you've had these arguments over and over and over again. And what is the point of them? Just put one foot in front of the other and march on.
What are the arguments?
Well, these arguments, I mean, in recent years, we've heard this business about mommy wars and leaning in and all of this stuff. You know, it's just you know, the conversation to me that's worth having is a conversation about equal pay for equal work, about making the workplace a far more caretaker-friendly place to be. And I don't just mean for moms; I mean for people taking care of old people. And you know, fully 1/3 of the households in this in this country are taking care of elderly or disabled family members. You know, there's caretaking is an enormous. It's a blessing, but it's also an enormous undertaking, and the workplace has to be far more accommodating to caretakers if we're going to be the most productive country that we want to be. And so those are the real issues, not whether this tiny slice of American society that can afford not to work is doing the right thing by staying home when they have small children. I mean, you know, fine if you want to stay home, fine if you don't want to stay home, fine. Why talk about it?
Ladies of Liberty, you write, my interest in the power of political wives comes from my own experiences growing up in politics.
Well, I talked about that earlier. I mean, the way that I saw my mother and her other political wives do the kinds of work they did really did have a huge impression on me, because I saw how incredibly influential they were.
Abigail Adams, remember the ladies.
Yeah, but it took a while, didn't it? So Abigail Adams she's such a fascinating character, and it's not all positive, but hardly anyone is. But she, in the time when the Continental Congress was meeting and trying to decide whether to declare independence, she had no patience with that whatsoever. She thought it was ridiculous that these men were just lily-livered, and she kept saying to them, "For heaven's sakes, declare independence! You know, these British are terrible." And by the way, they were occupying Boston. At this point, her husband writes to her and says, "If it gets really dangerous, take our children and fly to the woods." You know, thanks, John. I hope you're having a nice dinner in Philadelphia. But so she was very politically astute and thinking about all of these things. So as she started thinking about independence, she said to her husband, "You are going to have to come up with a new code of laws for our new country, and when you do, I ask you to remember the ladies, because all men would be tyrants if they could." Now, there's been a lot of commentary over the centuries about whether she was kidding. I don't think there's any question she was not kidding. She, in other letters to her friend Mercy Otis Warren, it's very clear she was not kidding. But was she talking about political power? Was she talking about legal rights? I don't know the answer to that. She certainly knew that women had no legal rights. Married women could not own property, and they were the property of their husbands. And I'm sure she saw abuse. And so my guess is she certainly wanted to see legal rights for women. But she also said in later letters, she talked about, if I can't vote, at least I can be a politician in this way. So she was aware of the fact that women did not have political rights.
Who was Mercy Otis Warren?
Mercy Otis Warren was a very important propagandist for the Revolution. She was from a famous political family, the Otises, and she had been educated in Boston with her brothers until they went to Harvard, and of course girls couldn't go to college. But she wrote plays and poems that were designed to rev up sentiment against the British, and she was very successful in doing that. And the Patriot men, John Adams and Sam Adams, kept asking her to write more. They met in her parlor, and she was right there at the time of the Revolution, really as a highly, highly influential propagandist.
You know, I'm going to opine and say I think my favorite woman
Yes.
back then was Deborah Reed Franklin?
Well, Deborah Reed Franklin was a really just stalwart, just carrying on sort of woman. She, of course, was Benjamin Franklin's wife. She was his common law wife. She was a very astute businesswoman. She was not literate, really. Her letters are badly spelled and all of that. But she could conduct business with great acumen. And in fact, you know, it always amuses me because you say, you know, we learned growing up in school, Benjamin Franklin, first Postmaster General of the United States, but he wasn't in the United States. He was in England for most of the years leading up to the Revolution, all those years, for a very long time. So she ran the Postal Service. And in fact, there are records of that, thankfully. And in fact, at one point, Lord Loudon, the nobleman who was the titular head, fired one of her workers, who of course was a cousin, and she got furious and told him off. And she said, not only are you interfering, but you're slowing down the service, and just back off. And there's a wonderful, I saw you had the children's book up. This is a beautifully illustrated children's version of Founding Mothers. And the illustrator, Diane Good, who's just terrific, has Deborah Reed holding Lord Loudon in her hand and just telling him off. It's quite wonderful.
So, in essence, Benjamin Franklin got the title, she did the work.
That's right. And that was true about their printing business as well. The printing business was essentially a franchise business of shops that went to the frontier, which was Pittsburgh. And she ran it, and she ran it very, very well. And so, but she missed him. She kept begging him to come home. He was gone for, you know, close to 20 years. And their only daughter got married, and he still wouldn't come home. He just said, keep the wedding cheap. Some things don't change. But finally she died. And he wrote to his friend that he had to go home because my wife, in whose hands I have left my affairs, has died. So poor Ben actually had to go home and figure out what his affairs were. But she had run everything. And I will say he did give her credit. I mean, he makes me crazy, but he did give her credit for that.
Cokie Roberts is the author of these books. We Are Our Mother's Daughters came out in 1998. From This Day Forward with Steve Roberts came out in 2000. Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, 2004. Ladies of Liberty, 2008. Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions for Interfaith Families, 2011. Founding Mothers, Remembering the Ladies, the children's version, came out in 2014. Book we have not talked about yet, your most recent, Capital Dames, The Civil War and the Women of Washington, just came out this year. Dames?
Dames. They are dames. They're colonial dames. You can have capital dames. But they are quite a group of women. I had frankly never wanted to write a Civil War book. My own family all fought on the losing side, but the interest in the Civil War is enormous, as you know, and of course we were in the middle of the sesquicentennial, a word that's hard to say, and so the publisher was interested in the Civil War book, and as I thought about it, I knew that there had to be some fascinating women to write about, and the question was how to confine it so it did not become some massive thing. It's still pretty big, but so I made it about Washington, and so it's a really interesting period.
And it's been a bestseller.
Yes.
But one of the
I'm
women,
happy to say they've all been bestsellers.
there you go. One of the women you write about, Cokie Roberts, is Verena Davis.
I love Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife. I'm not fond of him, but she is really a very interesting woman. She came here as a teenager. Of course, these women were also young, you know, they married in their teens, and she came here as a Senate wife, as a teenager, and loved it in Washington. She'd grown up in Natchez, and And then he was in the cabinet, and it was Franklin Pierce's cabinet. And Pierce's wife was in mourning. Her last child had been killed right before the presidency. And so Varina Davis was really the first lady at that period. He was Secretary of War. She ran a very extensive salon. And then he went back to the Senate and after the Pierce administration, and then, of course, seceded. And she became the First Lady of the Confederacy, much to her dismay. She knew that this was not a winning proposition. We don't have the manufacturing, we don't have the railroads. You'd think the men might have noticed too, but they didn't seem to. But she said, I'm going to do my job, and she did, although she was never fully accepted by the South. Her grandfather was the governor of New Jersey, and she was not fair-complected enough to be a true Southern belle. The Richmond papers talked about her as tawny, but she always was feisty and interesting, and she stayed in touch as much as she could with her friends in the North, particularly here in Washington, Elizabeth Blair Lee of Blair House fame, who was a very close friend of hers. And that was one of the things that was interesting, was to see how these women would not let their friendships disappear even though the men were killing each other, because they had become so close.
And she spent her final years in New York, in fact.
Well, so then after the war, first she helped get Jefferson Davis out of jail, and that is one of the things that I just loved in this book. These women, no matter who was president, would just march into the White House and tell off the president, right? You've got to do this, and it's just wonderful. I mean, I'm so jealous of them, and so she was one of those. Walked into Andy Johnson and said, get my husband out of jail, but. And then they had some very hard years after the war, and as I say, Jefferson Davis was not a likable person, but he then finally died, and she decided to move to New York. And of course it was a huge scandal. The First Lady of the Confederacy is moving to New York. But she wanted to do it. First of all, she needed to make a living. She didn't have any money, and she had a job offer as a journalist in New York. But secondly, she was ready to escape the whole lost cause thing. And she wrote to her daughter, and as I said to you earlier, she was referred to as Tawny. And so she wrote to her daughter and she said, I'm free, brown, and 64. I can go wherever I want to go. And she moved to New York. She worked for the New York World. She wrote some books. But she also ran a salon that was very popular. She was apparently a brilliant conversationalist. Everyone referred to her that way. And I think most interesting, she befriended Julia Grant. Of course, the wife of the general who defeated her husband's country. And when they first met, it was page one news in all the newspapers in the country. And that surprised me, too. The way these women actually were covered by the newspapers was surprising to me, that they were considered important enough to deserve coverage. And that meeting was everywhere in the country. And then she went to the dedication of the Grant Memorial very publicly in a very considered act of reconciliation.
You also write in Capital Dames, 50,000 people turned out for her funeral in Richmond.
Right. Well, her husband was buried there at the time, or he's buried in Metairie in New Orleans, but I guess they buried her in Richmond. And there was a huge Confederate showing for her funeral. But it also did involve participation by several important Yankees. And so it was not solely a Confederate outpouring.
Well, Cokie Roberts, as a daughter of the Confederacy, I mean, Colonel Claiborne,
right.
Wasn't it Colonel Claiborne? Or?
Well, my Boggs great-uncle, great-great-uncle, William Robertson Boggs, was a general in the Confederate Army, brigadier general. I actually was just recently sent by a cousin his parole. He didn't surrender until June of 1865, months after Appomattox in April. And he was one, but several, the Claibornes also, yes, absolutely. My mother's family fought for the Confederacy, yes.
So as a daughter of the Confederacy, in a sense, what do you think about some of the efforts to get rid of one of the flags, the symbols of the Confederacy?
Well, you know, one of my elderly cousins of my mother's generation, who was very much a dyed-in-the-wool Southerner, said it's about remembrance, not about respect. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. So I think having some context around these things makes all the sense in the world. And in places where they are offensive, as on the grounds of the Capitol in South Carolina, or in the flags of some of the states, Virginia, Georgia, that removing it makes a lot of sense. That it is, you know, first of all, this didn't happen after the Civil War. It happened in the 1950s with segregation and the re-rise of white supremacists. So it makes a lot of sense to get rid of symbols that are offensive and actually frightening to some people. But in places where they are, just part of the landscape and have been there to put some sort of context around them and talk about what the Confederacy was and what it did, is I think makes a great deal of sense. Use it as a history lesson, in other words. We don't know anywhere near enough history in this country.
How'd you get to ABC?
I got to ABC because they called me up and asked me. It's a nice way to come. I was working and still working at NPR, and I was also at that point working for what was then the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour. And I was asked to go on the roundtable for this week, and then they asked me to come on staff, and I said I would, as long as I didn't have to leave NPR. And so I've worked for both ever since, and that was 1988, so it was a good while ago.
So you've hosted this week. Were you the first female host on a Sunday morning program?
No, my dear friend Leslie Stahl was the host of Face the Nation. No.
What was it like to work with Sam Donaldson for
Sam's
8 years?
Sam is one of the most delightful people alive. He's moved home to New Mexico, and I miss him terribly. He is just one of the. He's a unique individual, and that's an overused word, but not in terms of Sam. One of the nicest, funniest people you'd ever, and kindest people you'd ever want to know. But also that persona, that sort of bombastic persona, is the real Sam. People ask me all the time, is there a hidden George Will? Is there a hidden Sam Donaldson? No, they are who they are. They're both delightful men.
How much are you working these days? I mean, are you semi-retired at all?
No. It's just different work. I work doing something every day. Right now I'm under some pressure because I'm writing the sequel to the children's book of Founding Mothers, the children's book of Ladies of Liberty, which is due this week. And the paperback of Capital Dames comes out in the spring, and so I'm proofing it for that. So it's a very busy moment right now, and as you might have noticed, the president will be on the air tonight. So that's my day job.
Cokie Roberts, how do you research somebody like Verena Davis? Where do you start?
Well, fortunately, on Verena Davis, there is a book of the Jefferson Davis family letters, and there have been a couple of good biographies of her. But then there are letters that are in university libraries. And so what has changed, which is such a joy, is that technology has made this much, much easier, so that you can be in touch with someone at a university library, and they will they can scan what they have and send it to you electronically. And so that's a huge help. Now, you still have to decipher the handwriting, and nothing's annotated, and so you have to figure out who the people are who are being referred to and all of that. But it's so much better than it was when I was doing Founding Mothers. But I just discovered in the end of October, I was in Louisiana for the book festival, and one of Verena Davis's descendants was there, and he has found her diary. And I am so angry that I did not have the diary for writing Capital Dames, because he says she does wonderful descriptions of all the houses in Washington and all of that. So he will be the person who gets to do that.
Was Washington a Southern town
Oh, totally.
during the Civil War?
Absolutely.
Southern sympathy, too?
Yes, yes. It was a Southern town with Southern sympathizers. And, of course, Virginia, of course, was the capital of the Confederacy, and Maryland was also very sympathetic to the South. Lincoln got something like 2% of the vote in Virginia and 3% of the vote in Maryland. Yes, he was not a popular figure in these parts, and so he came into a very hostile situation, and the town was filled with Southern sympathizers. I found serendipitously, my friend Ann Charnley found a diary of a woman just from the year 1861 who lived at Rosemont in Cleveland Park, and her descendant, Kathy O'Connell, was kind enough to let me use it. And she had daughters in Virginia, and it's very clear from her diary that her family is Confederate sympathizers, and she's trying to keep her children quiet so that the Union troops stationed around the town don't harass them.
Founding Mothers was featured on the History Channel.
Right.
What was that like, working on that program?
Well, it was interesting
series?
because I had never done reenactments. You know, I'm such a journalist, and these books are nonfiction books. You know, very, very carefully researched books. So I didn't. I hadn't had that experience, but fortunately, the producer on that show was ABC Productions, and they were very careful about the reenactments.
You describe a woman named Elizabeth Ellet as your heroine. Who was Elizabeth Ellet?
She was my heroine when I was doing Founding Mothers, because she had done the legwork in the 19th century. She had tried to find out as much as she could about the women of the Revolutionary period, either the ones who were still living, like Elizabeth Hamilton, or the ones who were whose descendants were still, you know, quite cognizant of their ancestors. And so she wrote down everything she could and did a couple of volumes about it. She was something of a character herself, but she did at least try to preserve that history.
If you want to know why Aaron Burr ended up as the villain in the founding stories, let me introduce you to his family, you write.
Yeah, well, they were not a great group. His father, Aaron Burr Sr., was the president of Princeton, as was his grandfather, Jonathan Edwards. But his mother and father both died when he was very young. And so he was raised by uncles, and he wasn't really raised at all. You know, he was raised by wolves, and so he did not grow up with exactly the right values.
But his mother was a letter writer, and
his
you
mother,
had a lot of
thankfully, did write letters.
She seemed overwhelmed a lot of her life.
She was overwhelmed. She was the daughter of Jonathan Edwards, who was the great preacher of the Great Awakening, and he was. They had, I don't know, 12, 13, 16 children, whatever, and he, of course, was so busy being the great preacher that her mother really had to do all the work, and she as a young, I mean, they were all so young, you know, she is a young girl, really, marries Aaron Burr, who's minister, and she has to be a minister's wife, and it's hard. And then he becomes president of Princeton, and it's really hard. The expectations of her were enormous in terms of what she had to do socially and what she was supposed to do religiously, and raising these two little children. She had two in 2 years, and she never thought she was good enough, and all of that. It was all just really hard for her, and she was not with anybody she knew. She was just with her husband in Princeton, not with her family, and so that was hard. Fortunately for her, I think one of the great ladies of the Revolutionary period, Anna Spudno Stockton, was an older woman who was there and did try to help her some.
You note that you are writing about mostly elite women.
Right.
Why?
Because they're the people who had the ears of the Founding Fathers. I came at this from having learned about the Founding Fathers and wanting to know what the women of the era were doing who would have the ability to influence them in the ways that the political women of my generation influenced the men. So it was taking it from that starting point.
We've talked about some of the salons throughout the years. Anyone today holding these salons, these Washington gatherings?
Not really. Mrs. Graham did when she was alive, Katharine Graham, who of course was the publisher of the Washington Post. She would have dinners that were filled with the glittery people, but not. I don't mean glittery in an unsubstantial way. So substantial people, but really, it's not part of the culture today.
Cokie Roberts is our guest. We have talked for 1 hour. Now it's your turn. Phone numbers are on the screen. 202 is the area code, 748-8200. For those of you in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201. If you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, if you can't get through on the phone lines, you still want to make a comment, try a text message, 202-717-9684, just for text, not for calls. And if you would, include your first name and your city so we can identify you. We'll also flash up the different ways you can get a hold of Cokie Roberts via social media. Neville in Cleveland, Ohio, you have been a very patient man. Please go ahead with your question or comment for Cokie Roberts.
Ms. Roberts, considering your personal background, with both parents having served several terms in Congress, I wonder, having lived for a time in Washington, D.C., to what extent do you consider yourself a Washington, D.C. insider, a Beltway person?
Neville, why do you ask that question?
Well, I'm wondering if she brings a unique perspective to connecting what's going on in politics today. Not many people have that unique background, so I'm asking that question.
Thank you, sir.
Well, it's funny because my reaction to that was first to say Beltway person, but the truth is I am a great believer in Washington and in the work of Washington. I think that what government does matters, and I think that understanding the workings of government is important. I think it's important to be an informed voter, and I also think that the people who come here to serve in both parties, most of them, almost all of them, do it out of a sense of desire to be good public servants and to be able to help people in their districts, their states, in the country to buy their lights. And so I am an admirer of Washington and an admirer of the work that's done here. And so I think that this notion of trying to vilify the government and the people who serve in government is very destructive. I think that the only thing we have, I would commend to anybody who hasn't done it, to come here and go to the National Archives and go into the rotunda there. It's the closest thing we have to a national cathedral. And there are the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Like I always say as a Catholic, they're like Our Lady's altar, the main altar, and St. Joseph's altar. But there they are as our charters of freedom that have created this country. And that's what America is. America is an idea that was created to allow for government by the people, for the people. And that is what Washington does. Washington is that government. And I think that the notion of trying to turn it into some kind of evil entity is really fundamentally un-American. And so I would proudly say, yes, that I am a Beltway person, but a Beltway person with who still calls New Orleans home.
Have you ever thought about running for office? You had a parent in office for 50 years.
Right. I'm the only member of my original nuclear family not to run for Congress. They didn't all win. My mother's the only person who never lost an election. But
your father lost an election?
My father lost his second election to the Congress, and then he lost a gubernatorial election. But the fact is that I have always felt guilty about not running for office. But being married to a journalist who was always going to be a journalist from the time he was a little boy, it would have been a little hard on him if I had run for office. So I've tried to assuage my guilt by telling people, by reporting on it, so that I feel like at least that way I can serve voters.
Cokie Roberts, because of who you are, can you call Paul Ryan and get an interview quickly, or get through to him?
I could probably get through to Paul Ryan. I hope so. I think he's a very interesting, smart, and dedicated member of Congress.
This is a text message from Kimberly in Atlanta. I had the high honor of receiving your mother's recommendation for the Citizenship Scholarship to attend Loyola in New Orleans. She remains a huge hero of mine and one of the reasons I have spent 25 years advocating for children, women, families, and education and social justice. I look forward to reading your book. Ms. Roberts, I can only imagine how aghast and alarmed your mom would be at the tenor of this year's presidential primary rhetoric.
Well, my mother would not like the primary rhetoric. That is certainly true. But first of all, let me say, she would be so proud of this woman. I mean, she'd be thrilled to know that she has had that legacy. But the rhetoric is hateful, and I mean, let's just start with rude. That mama wouldn't like that. But hateful and personal, and it's not the way political discourse should be carried out.
Is today unique from what you've observed?
No, meet the period before the Civil War. It was a horrible period, but then we had war, and so we don't want to replicate that.
Ken, Atlanta. Good afternoon. You're on with Cokie Roberts.
Miss Cokie, I'm just thrilled to death. The email or whatever you received from Kimberly just a moment ago, that's my daughter. I called her after I found out y'all were on TV, and I said, Kimberly, I found the picture of Cokie's mama taken with our family, and it turned out to be part of the award that Kimberly got because of your mama's nomination. So it turns out she beat me to get on the air.
That's probably, Ken, that's probably happened to you over and over now that she's got that fine Loyola education, right?
And you could tell by the way she wrote that thing that she's way ahead of her daddy when it comes to spelling and grammar and all that stuff.
Well,
so Ken,
how nice for you to to have such an accomplished daughter.
Ken, did you call in to tell the same story, or did you have a question or another comment?
No, I've got a comment that there was a project that my family was working on, and that was one of the reasons the picture with Cokie's mama. And it's called Our Republic Walk, and it's going to be activated throughout the United States next year by all the state legislatures. And I'm now involved in gathering the stories around the characters, and two ladies in Congress were incredibly helpful. Cokie, one was your mama, and the other was, did you know a lady named Tilly Fowler?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Well, Miss Tilly, it was the daughter of a Senator Culver Kidd out of Milledgeville, Georgia, who was the foundation of this project. And one of the great things about Tilly and her daddy was known as a silver fox.
Right.
And Tilly was known as a steel magnolia. And I didn't think about it till now, but when Kimberly called in, it dawned on me, we ought to get Kimberly to write a book about those two characters. But anyhow...
Ken, wasn't Representative Fowler, wasn't she a Republican from, I want to say, Florida?
Now, she was. She was out of... when I first met Tilly, she was a member of the City Council of Jacksonville. And then she wound up with her career in Congress representing that district in Florida.
All right.
She and her dad were famous for their fights. But one of the things that you have brought out is Senator Kidd told me one day that his 40-something career in the Georgia General Assembly was no fun anymore. And I asked him, what are you talking about? And he said, well, the civility, the ability to respect each other. Something's happened. It seems to have gone. And I think this is what Kimberly was talking about.
Right.
And but let me let y'all go.
Okay.
I just
All right,
Well,
Ken,
you get her
thanks
to
for
write
calling
that
in.
book. That's a good idea.
Charlene is in Reno, Nevada. Hi, Charlene.
Hi. Cokie, I really appreciate your work
Thank
as
you.
a journalist, and thank you for giving women a history.
Thank you.
My question to you is, how did you do your research for your books? It's almost as if you're right there in the conversations.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you feel that way. I really try very hard to make them as much in the words of the women themselves as I possibly can. But it's a combination of it's really detective work to do women's history. But in some cases, there are books that have been published, and that's very helpful, particularly if they're books just of letters. But in other cases, what I do is go to the footnotes in books about the men and see what I can find. And then, again, thanks to technology, I can find out easily online where the men's letters are, and then call up those institutions and find out if they have the women's letters as well. And since I've been doing these books, there has been a lot more recognition that it is worth publishing. So I've gotten a lot of wonderful cooperation from the curators and librarians at universities, libraries, manuscripts divisions, the Library of Congress, the historical societies, historical homes. All of those places have been just wonderfully, wonderfully helpful. And the other thing that was true for this most recent book, Capital Dames, was that now newspapers are online, and I cannot tell you how much fun that is. I mean, you can waste days just reading newspapers because all the ads are there, everything's there, so you really got a picture of what life was like. And so there are two wonderful sites. One is free, that we taxpayers are paying for through the National Endowment for the Humanities, and it's on the Library of Congress website. It's called Chronicling America, and the other you pay for. It's called newspapers.com. But you can put in search words and dates, and you get newspapers coming up from all over the country. And so that's been a huge advance from when I first started writing these books.
In two of your books, you include recipes.
I do include
Why?
recipes because I think it's a connection. One of the things that I think is true about women is that there's certain ways that we connect no matter where we are and no matter when we are. And one of the ways is through recipes. And so I decided to put some of these women's recipes in. Some of them are pretty scary, like to dress a hog, what is it, a calf's head or a hog's head? But some of them you can absolutely make, I've made, and they're delicious.
Hearty choke pie.
Choke pie, which is artichoke pie.
Oh, okay.
And that's a Martha Washington recipe.
You have to use marrow bones.
And
What's a marrow bone?
Well, you could use beef broth. The Martha Washington's cookbook, which is at the, much to Mount Vernon's dismay, is at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, was given to her by her first mother-in-law, by the Custis mother. And so that cookbook has to be back to the 17th century at least.
Is it fair to say, 250 years later, that George Washington would not have been George Washington without Martha Washington?
Oh, I think absolutely.
She had the money.
She had the money, first of all, right? It was her first husband's money, and she was very astute about using it. He was too, though. He was a good custodian of her money, but she also had a real public relations sense, and as much as she loved her silks and satins, she knew to wear homespun when he was first president. And she did have to work out this complicated business of being the first lady and trying to both be informal and inclusive enough to please the people who had just fought a revolution against a monarchy, but also formal and sort of serious enough to have the European powers not laugh at us. And so it was a tough line to walk.
David, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you're on with author and journalist Cokie Roberts. Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. My vocation in life is that of a middle school U.S. history and U.S. civics teacher.
Yay!
Thank you. I would like to know what women, you can imagine our textbooks.
Oh, they're horrible. They're horrible. Why, just burn them. I mean, really, they're not worth using.
Okay, I'll tell my principal tomorrow we're burning our textbooks. What women do you think are most critical that my students at the end of the year have covered in class? And have you come across any minority women of African American or Hispanic background that are critical to United States history?
And David, before Cokie Roberts answers that, what do you try to do in 1 year in your history class in middle school? Who do you try to cover? What years do you try to cover? Who are some of the people that you cover?
With U.S. history, we try to cover as much as possible from the 13 colonies up through to as close to the present as we can possibly get. And technology has been wonderful in that you can bring in resources that aren't in your textbook. And so I don't use my textbook nearly as much as I used to in the early parts of my teaching career.
Who are the women that you talk about from the textbook?
Abigail Adams. I think Eleanor Roosevelt is amazing, absolutely amazing, one of the most important people in United States history. And what is covered in our textbook is just a little blurb on Eleanor Roosevelt.
Is Betsy Ross mentioned in your textbook? Because Cokie Roberts doesn't really write about Betsy Ross.
I do write about her, and I do.
She's not a primary figure.
No, but I do believe her story is true. No, because I did find a contemporaneous reference.
All right. So what's your advice to David?
First of all, bravo to you, and I'm thrilled to know they're even teaching middle school history, because there's too many places where we're losing that, and it's really shocking that our children are not learning our history the way they should. And I will tell you that I wrote these books very much in a manner that they are readable by middle school students. I have like 4 grandchildren in middle school right now, and so I can tell you it's fun for them to read these books, because they're conversational, and they're not too hard. But in terms of minority women, again, now we've been talking, as I said, about elite women who had the ears of the Founding Fathers. But Phyllis Wheatley, I do cover because she wrote about George Washington, and she went to see him, and he asked to meet her because she had been so gifted by the muse. And I write about Lucy Terry Prince in Ladies of Liberty, who wrote the first poem written by an African American, the Bars Fight, and then of course Sacagawea. I discovered it's Gawea, not Joea, who is one of the most interesting people I've ever gotten to know. She was so resourceful, and and I know about her entirely through the journals of Lewis and Clark, and it's so clear how in the course of the journey they get to know her and value her more and more as the journey progresses. So maybe pulling some of those journals, the parts about her would be interesting to the kids, because honestly, it's noticeable how Clark's view of her changes in the course of the trip. I do not have any Hispanic women. A woman from New Orleans, Louise Dabizac Livingston, is of European descent, but came from the island of San Domingue, which is now Haiti, and was really an example of sort of multiculturalism at this period of time, because with the purchase of New Orleans, that's when you first got that difference in American society that we, with any luck, celebrate today. So there are a variety of different women here, but I do highly recommend that the kids just, take a look at the books, because I'm really not trying to sell books, but I do think it's something they find interesting. And then the kids' book works for, slightly less ambitious learners, but it's chock full of information and wonderful pictures. So I do think that there are ways in this literature, which is why I wrote it, because I really want the kids to read it. And people say to me all the time, well, it's important for girls. Well, you know what? It's important for boys, too. I mean, the notion that only girls can read about women just makes me nuts.
So these two books, Ladies of Liberty, Founding Mothers.
Right.
8th graders could pick up?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Capital Dames, too. Absolutely.
Joe is in Carmel, Indiana. Joe, you're on with author Cokie Roberts. Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. I wanted to ask you about some issues that are too complex to even be talked about on radio or television, even when you've got a 3-hour program like this one, which is very unusual. I remember when Ross Perot was running for president, and you were on, I think, with David Brinkley on the This Week program, and a question arose about the difference between a 3-way race and a 2-way race, the dynamics. And you pretty much threw up your hands in the air and said, this is too complicated for me to even think about. Well, there's another question going on right now that's it's even more complicated than that one. And that is, I think it's quite plausible that Donald Trump entered this race because he didn't want any Republican that's for the fair tax to get into the White House, because the fair tax would hit real estate so hard. I wondered if you have an opinion on that, and if you have any thoughts about how complicated issues can be extremely important in an election.
Well, I don't think I ever threw up my hands and said it was too complicated to think about a 3-way race. It was actually pretty easy to think about, but it had a tremendous impact. Ross Perot's 19% of the vote in that race influenced the Congress for years to come. But, it's possible that Donald Trump has motives other than wanting to win the presidency, but I would not ascribe those to him. I think that I'll take him at face value that he wants to be president. We'll see whether that's possible or not. But the notion that he's doing this to line his own pockets or to keep them from being stripped would surprise me, because he's spending a whole lot of money. He's stripping his own pockets as he goes about the country doing this now.
Is he someone you know?
I've met him. I interviewed him one of the times that he was talking about running for president, but I certainly don't know him.
Are there any presidential candidates that you haven't met, interviewed, know? Ted Cruz, maybe? He's newer on the scene.
He was in my daughter's class in college. But I think I've met him, on the Hill. I guess I've probably met them. I've probably met them all, but I don't know them.
Text message for you from area code 214. Thank you so much for upholding your family values and a long tradition of public service. I believe money...
This is Houston, I believe,
is
214.
That 214?
I think so.
I believe money in politics is what has changed our government the most, not just where it comes from, but where it is not spent on campaigns.
Well, money in politics is a serious problem, and it has lots of effects, one of which is to keep people out who would be good candidates and good public servants. One is to distract people from doing the jobs that they should be doing in terms of governing, to get out and raise money all the time. One of the things we're seeing right now is that because of the way that super PACs can support a candidate, is that we're not having the normal winnowing process in the presidential campaign. Now, that's got its advantages, because it means that a lot of people will still be there when people actually start voting. And so the voters will have more choices. But it does have a tremendous impact, and it both keeps people out of politics and drives people out of politics. And that's a serious issue.
John is calling in from Delaware, Ohio. John, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Well, thank you very much, C-SPAN, for letting me speak to Ms. Roberts. It's really an honor to talk to her. I would just like to know, considering the legacy of past presidents and first ladies, some presidents we always remember, like Washington and Lincoln, and some presidents being totally forgotten. What do you think the lasting legacy of President and First Lady Obama will be in comparison? Will Obamacare last? What about his foreign policy?
Thank you, John.
He's had so much...
We're going to leave it there and get an answer.
Well, as President George W. Bush always says, you need a little bit more time to know what a legacy is going to be. History takes time, and so we will not know. But I do think, in terms of Mrs. Obama, actually we've already seen some change in children's obesity rates, and that is a subject that she's spent an enormous amount of time and energy on, and so I think that she's had an impact there. And one of the things that is true is that First Ladies continue on the topics that they are interested in after they leave office. And so I think that you will see Mrs. Obama on the public stage. She and Mrs. Bush, Laura Bush, have done things together, and after Mrs. Obama is no longer in the White House, she will have the opportunity to do that more. I had the wonderful opportunity twice to interview the two of them together, which was utterly delightful. And to see how they cooperate with each other, like each other, work together, and I think you'll see a lot more of that after the presidency. In terms of President Obama's policy legacy, again, we'll have to wait and see. I do think that aspects of Obamacare have now permeated the entire health system and will stay there. But whether the entire legislation sticks around or not, we don't know. But it's the kind of thing that gets tweaked anyway. We're already seeing problems with the exchanges, and so there are changes that will be made under any circumstances, regardless of who's president or who's in Congress. And in terms of foreign policy, we're at such a difficult period that we really are in the middle of of chaos almost in the world, and I think we just have to wait and see how that plays out.
As you know, Cokie Roberts, you participated in it. C-SPAN did a series last year on the First Ladies.
Right, right.
And one of the women who came up for 50 years throughout the series was Dolly Madison. She not only was First Lady, but she stayed, she
ran Washington.
There you go.
She did. She, for years, before she was First Lady, too, she arrived here in 1801 with her husband as Secretary of State, and Washington was this pathetic little mud hole, and already the country was having the kind of partisanship that we see today, and regionalism, and it was really threatening this fragile little tiny brand new country, and she understood that to hold the country together, that she had to bring the people together. And so she had events, parties, where the men who were in government had to be there. They had to be there because if they weren't there, they missed out on all the political information and all the political deal-making. And so she insisted that they come together and that they have drinks together and that they behave. And she really did keep the country together in that period. And then she was First Lady, where she became wildly popular, particularly after the British invasion of Washington, where she saved the portrait of George Washington. But she came back 2 days after to this burned out, flooded, because there had also been a huge storm, city, and started lobbying to keep the Capitol in Washington. And she was very successful in that. And then she did go off for a few years after Madison's retirement from the White House and back to Virginia, to Montpelier. But she was always writing letters saying, tell me what's going on in Washington. And then she did come back as a widow, where she really reigned over the city until she died in 1849. So it was a stretch of basically a half century. And every head of state called on her and asked her for advice. And when visiting heads of state came, they would call on her. She was very much the prominent personage of the city.
Text message, why do you think American history is not taught in schools anymore? I know a very smart young friend who has never heard of James Madison.
No, it's awful. Well, it's for a whole variety of reasons. The emphasis on testing has been much more on math and reading, and I don't know why the reading can't be about American history, but so it has not gotten the kind of attention that it should get. And then it has a lot to do with testing, because if advanced placement tests aren't in history, then people don't want to teach the history because they want to teach to the test. And all of that. So it's a real issue. But honestly, if we don't know our history, we don't understand what the country's all about. And that's a terrible tragedy. And James Madison wrote the Constitution. And so the notion that they've never heard of James Madison is somewhat scary.
Your book, Founding Mothers, it says here that this book supports the Common Core learning standards for English language arts and literacy and history social studies.
Well, you know, what's happened around Common Core is just absurd. And both sides, by the way, both the liberals and conservatives have just been silly about it. I think it might have even started with me, now that I think of it, because one day I was moderating an enormous panel of governors at the 50th anniversary of the National Governors Association. Ed Rendell was the president, and he brought back a lot of former governors. So it was this great, huge stage full of governors and ex-governors. And I was moderating it on the subject of education. And I think I asked them to raise their hands if they thought they could come together on some set of standards that they could all agree on. And they all raised their hands, and not long after that we got Common Core. So I don't know. But at any rate, what it is, it was conceived in the states, not in Washington. Washington had nothing to do with Common Core. And it was an attempt on the part of the states to try to get some sort of uniformity about what people were learning in schools, so that you had some ability to know what young people were being educated in. And it's still run by the states, but it's become a bugaboo on both sides because of various reasons. And that's a shame, because the idea behind it is excellence. And I don't think any of us would want our children not to have an excellent education.
Text message from Ray in North Dakota. Dear Cokie, what woman do you think should be pictured on the $10 bill?
I've gotten this a lot, and I've had a lot of trouble with it. Now, what I can tell you is I've got absolutely no problem getting rid of Alexander Hamilton. Not my favorite. Cute, he's cute, I'll give him cute. But Alexander Hamilton, you know, not only cheated on his wife, but he then fought this ridiculous duel, leaving her penniless with 7 children. So if he was such a great Secretary of the Treasury, why was his wife left in debt? So I lose no love for him. But my real problem with a woman on the bill is, of course, the women did not have the same kind of power, and still do not have the same kind of power as the men who are on our currency. But the woman who I can make a really good case for is Clara Barton. Clara Barton, not only, and this is one of the things that when I say textbooks are terrible, our textbooks will say, if they mention her at all, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross, like, you know, it just happened overnight and it was easy. But in fact, she was, you know, very, very influential throughout the war as a supplier and as a nurse. But then she did found the American Red Cross, but in order to have it be effective, she needed it to be aligned with the International Red Cross, which required decades of lobbying the United States Congress to have the Senate ratify the Geneva Convention, which is the same Geneva Conventions we're talking about today. But she then inserted the American Amendment. And when she went as the American representative to Geneva in 1884, they passed the American Amendment, which is still referred to that way in international relief circles. And what that said was that the International Red Cross could not only go into war zones, which is what it had been doing, but could also go in after a natural disaster. So anytime you hear about the Red Cross being someplace after an earthquake in Nepal or a flood in the Midwest or after Katrina in New Orleans or whatever it is, it's because of Clara Barton. So I can make a case for her.
And I want to point out, in Capital Dames, you do an epilogue, which I thought was really interesting, talking about how Clara Barton went overseas after the Civil War for a long time, recuperating, as you say. But there's an epilogue of all the characters who are covered in Capital Dames.
Well, because the book ends in 1868 with the inauguration of Grant. And so what happened to all these women after that? So the epilogue tells you.
Nancy, Redondo Beach, California, thanks for holding your on with author and journalist Cokie Roberts on Book TV.
First of all, Miss Roberts, you're a national treasure.
Oh, thank you. That's making me feel very old.
Well, it's so true. No. I even think young people are national treasures.
Oh, good. Okay,
Do not feel, please. And if you could interview anyone, any woman, dead or alive, who would that be and why? And I'll hang up for your answer.
Oh, gosh, you know, I'm going to be terrible at this answer because there's so many I'd like to interview, and many of them are very different from each other. You know, Hatshepsut, or however you pronounce it, the female pharaoh, she must have been a piece of work. St. Catherine of Siena. I mean, there are so many different women. All of the American female saints, who are just one courageous, wonderful woman after another, from Elizabeth Seton to Frances Cabrini to Mother Theodore Guerin. I mean, they're a fabulous group of women. So I just don't know where I'd begin and end with it. There's so many I'd like to sit down with. That's heaven for me. I'm looking forward to that in heaven.
Bonnie in Louisville texts into you, Cokie Roberts. Being black with awareness of the many shades of black Farina Davis looks like she could be family. Was that speculated about her?
Sure it was. As anybody, particularly in the South, knows, the shades of black were, there was always a speculation. Of course, just one drop of blood could mean segregation and all of that. So there was some speculation about that. But it wasn't as much that as Yankee. It wasn't as much that she was speculated as being a darky, as they would have said, as being a Yankee.
Shirley in Menasha, Wisconsin. Are your books on audio tape?
Yes. My books are all on audio tape,
read
and
them?
I have read them all. Yes.
What was that process like?
It's hard. It's easier for me as a broadcaster than it is for most people, I think. I'm used to using my voice. And actually, the harder part, I write these books very, very self-consciously in my voice. Because, and I don't mean this to sound self-important, but a lot of people in America know my voice. And so, I mean, I've been on the radio forever and ever, amen. And so the fact is, to write in my voice, I think, is important. It's harder to write in my voice than it is to write pretty. But I do write the books in my voice, so it does make it easier to read them than it would otherwise.
Every time we have an author on In Depth on Book TV, we ask him or her about their favorites, what they're reading currently, some of their influences. We're going to show you what Cokie Roberts had to say. We're also going to show you a little bit from a book party for Capital Dames that Book TV covered earlier this year. And our live program will continue after this.
The truth is, these are great ladies, and they're so much fun to learn about, and they are funny and feisty and frank and irreverent, and they tell you things like, you know, Stephen Douglas stinks, and you know, they tell you things the guys don't tell you, and it's really a whole lot of fun to learn about it and read about it, and really I enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed it now that it's over, and I actually did enjoy reading it when it was over, so I hope you do too.
Cokie Roberts, who is Ellen Gilchrist?
Ellen Gilchrist is a wonderful writer of short stories. She's from New Orleans, or Mississippi-New Orleans combination. I've never met her. She was supposed to be at the Louisiana Book Festival, and I looked all over for her but didn't find her. But I love her short stories.
What makes New Orleans?
New Orleans. What makes it?
New Orleans?
No, but what makes it special?
What makes it, well, unique was the word I was going to use, and a little bit different than the rest of the country. It's one of the few unique places left.
No, I always say it's like an ethnicity to come from New Orleans, that we have our own food, our own music, basically our own language, and a real sense of place. And it is not. It isn't like any other place in the country. It's much more Mediterranean. In fact, in Capital Dames, Elizabeth Blair Lee, who was here in Washington and is a Union, very much for the Union, but she's at various times says, you know, I have trouble thinking of the South as our enemy. They're all our relatives in Kentucky and in Virginia and Tennessee, and she says, now New Orleans, that's different. They're a bunch of French people in quadroons. And so that was a sense that it was just a foreign place. Now it was a foreign place with a very important port, and that was true throughout the history of this country. But it was always welcoming to all, and remains welcoming to all kinds of people. When I was growing up, always all the store windows said "On parle français, français ici, j'habla espagnol." So there was always that sense of multiple languages and partying. You know, it's a great place to party and parade, and that spirit just permeates the place. Going right after Katrina, my biggest sense. Well, even with all the huge devastation that was there, the thing that I couldn't get over the most was the silence. I had never been in the city in my whole life when it was silent. And finally, one day, there was a soul trumpet that played, and I thought, thank God, you know, somebody's back with an instrument. But so it's a special place.
I think it's in Capital Dames that you talk about a trip you took to Fort Sumter with your grandkids.
I did. That's, yes, I've taken each set of grandkids to Fort Sumter, but we were there with my daughter's children, and at that point her youngest was fairly young. And of course, you know how these kids go to these places and try to, you know, completely scavenger in the gift shop. And so he says to his mother, what side were we on? He didn't know whether to buy blue or gray. And she said, well, everybody who was alive in your family at the time fought for the South, but it was good for the country that the North won. And I think that's a very good description.
In From This Day Forward, written with your husband, Steve Roberts, you talk about the Vietnam War and a luncheon you had with your folks at 21.
Not one of my proudest moments, right?
What happened?
Well, there was a time when people were very, tempers were flaring over the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of generational conflict. And my father was in the Democratic leadership of Congress and a strong supporter of President Johnson's, and the Johnson family and our family were very close. And my husband was, you know, subject to the draft, and it was a very bad moment when we got in a big screaming fight in public about the Vietnam War, which was not something that I normally would do.
And you say you regret it to this day?
Oh yeah, I do regret it to this day.
This is a text message from Dan in Chicago. Having suffered sudden family loss myself, I wonder if Cokie could speak to the loss of her father, Hal Boggs, in a plane crash, and the conspiratorial mention surrounding it. Was there a conspiracy around that?
It continues to this day. And it's understandable. You know, the plane was never found, and so people always have conspiracies about things like that. Amelia Earhart, there's conspiracies around to this day. But It was, of course, incredibly shocking and painful, and not having a body, frankly, is a very unsettling thing. There's a reason for our rituals around death, and they are. The word closure is a terrible word, and I don't believe in it, but they are comforting, and they are a way of understanding that the death has actually occurred. And not having that is very unsettling. It's the only word I can use. And I, as I said earlier, live in the house that I grew up in. And for a long time after we moved in, I was hesitant to change the kitchen wallpaper because I thought, maybe he'll show up and be confused if the wallpaper isn't the same. So, just totally irrational attitudes, and I didn't act on them, but they were there in the back of my brain. So it's a very difficult sort of situation to have to deal with. I know intellectually that by far the most likely thing to have happened is that the plane iced up and sunk to the bottom of Prince William Sound, which is 600 feet deep, and was just never seen again. But that's one thing to know intellectually and another thing to embrace emotionally. And there are conspiracy theories, ranging from he was on the Warren Commission and maybe he knew something about the Kennedy death, or he and Herbert Hoover had crossed swords, and maybe there was something with Hoover. There have been all kinds of conspiracy theories. I don't think that that's the way life works. I think conspiracies are much too rational. I think that life is much less rational than that.
And this text message, wonderful example of women bring about change. I wonder if you know of the book Written Out of History by Sandra Henry and Emily Tatz. With your unique background, I thought you might be interested in the whole idea of women being ignored by historians. That's from Barbara.
I do know about the book, and it's true. Women have been ignored by historians. Our names are not on the documents, and we weren't the generals in the wars. And so there is a sense that, therefore, the women weren't important. That's why I've devoted a great part of my life to trying to change that.
202 is the area code, 748-8200 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific. You can also send a text message. Just include your first name and your city if you would. Don't call this number, just for text messages, 202-717-9684. And in this second half of our program, we're going to be looking at some of the Twitter messages and the Facebook comments as well. But right now, it's Laura in Erie, Pennsylvania, on Book TV with Cokie Roberts.
Good afternoon. Want to tell you, Cokie, I have to bring up an issue that might be one of the ones that you referred to about talking to Gloria Steinem that might be exhausting, and it's abortion. I don't know what your personal views are, but I think it has been just an atrocity that millions of 55 million plus unborn babies since Roe v. Wade have been killed in abortion. And I think you're Catholic. I would like to hear your views about what we could do to lessen the number. I know it's going down, and most of us deplore the acts of the person who shot up Planned Parenthood. But I wanted to ask you particularly if you think that there was an article in The Guardian about Save Unborn Life. It's a charity that offers money to women who don't want to abort, but they do because of financial struggles.
All right, Laura, I think we got your point. Let's get an answer from Cokie Roberts.
I think that movement to try to help women who want to carry their babies to term is very important. It's one of the things that has been true in the Catholic Church for a long time, particularly the religious women of the Church trying to help those women. It's clearly a subject that is terrible divisiveness in the country because it's not something it's not like money where you can split the difference. And so people who feel very strongly, morally on both sides, actually. But I think that for those of us who would like to see no abortions, that the answer really is moral suasion rather than laws, because we know what happens when you pass laws that people don't believe in and go around. So I think that the work on moral suasion actually is succeeding to some degree. As you just said, the number of abortions has gone down, and the attitudes among young people on the subject are very different from among young people of an earlier age. So I think that to continue to be compassionate and to show mercy, as the Pope said, to the people who have found themselves in this position makes a tremendous, a great deal of sense, and will also have an impact, because being angry and hateful is not the way to win hearts and minds.
Chapter 6 from this day forward is on divorce, and you talk about the fact that Roman Catholics divorce at the same rates as other groups, and you go on to say
have abortions at the same rates.
One reason for this trend is that divorce breeds divorce. As the National Marriage Project puts it, divorce is an ever-present theme in the books, music, and movies of the youth culture, and real-life experience is hardly reassuring.
Well, you know, again, there's some evidence that the divorce rate is going down. And, of course, what does happen with divorces is there's a good bit of recidivism. I certainly saw it with my kids' generation, where they were so aware of their friends' parents' divorces that it was something that they kind of looked for in mates, of hoping that they could find someone that was not out of that sort of pattern of divorce. But, you know, look, it's like anything else. Are there some people for whom divorce is the right answer? Absolutely. And particularly, of course, in an abusive situation. But are all divorces bad? Absolutely not. But, you know, to the degree that you can try to stay married forever, you know, I think it's probably better, but it's not for everybody. And you know, I'm not the person to preach that.
Why did you devote a whole chapter in this book to that?
Because you can't talk about marriage without talking about divorce. No.
Next call for Cokie Roberts comes from Brent in Portland, Oregon. Hi, Brent.
Hi. Yes, Cokie, do you think that we would ever have the political will to have publicly financed national campaigns for our Washington politicians?
No.
To help level the playing field?
My answer to that question is no. There was, you know, the brief moment in our history where we had that, and then the Supreme Court ruled in Vallejo versus Buckley that you couldn't keep somebody from spending his own money in a political campaign. And so that started to unravel the whole thing. And as you well know, since then, it's been unraveled even more. But even before we had the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court, you did not have members of Congress voting to publicly finance campaigns for two reasons. One is that it's always hard to get people to change the financing of from the way they were elected. They got there under the current system. So that's always difficult. But it's also true that if you try to go to the taxpayers and say you're going to pay for political campaigns, most taxpayers would be up in arms. So it's a very, very, very hard nut to crack.
Cokie Roberts wrote her first book in 1998, We Are Our Mother's Daughters, From This Day Forward, with her husband Steve Roberts, came out in 2000. Founding Mothers, The Women Who Raised Our Nation, came out in 2004. Ladies of Liberty in 2008. Our Haggadah, Uniting Traditions for Interfaith Families, came out in 2011. Founding Mothers, Remembering the Ladies, which was her first children's book, working on her second currently. Founding Mothers came out in 2014, and her most recent bestseller is Capital Dames, the Civil War and the Women of Washington. By the way,
there was also a revised, this is the revised and expanded version of We Are Our Mother's Daughters, which came out in like 2009.
It's when this was revised and put out. So yes, there is a revised, updated version of We Are Our Mother's Daughters. And
you have a noisy machine over there.
And I got a noisy machine over here, and I apologize for that. Kay in Denver, hi.
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 I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to see this program.
Good.
It's been wonderful. Cokie, I first heard of you, actually met you, in Commerce, Texas, in 1975. You came to the Sam Rayburn Symposium on that small school campus, along with Lady Bird, Sarah Weddington, Liz Carpenter, and a host of other wonderful people. I'm so glad I had the opportunity to hear you because I continue to teach high school government.
Wonderful. Oh, that's great.
And I've loved all your works, and it's just wonderful to have this opportunity to see you. Would you tell me the proper way that I, a former Texan and now Colorado, should pronounce the name of your state?
Oh, well, in Texas, you probably say Louisiana. But
mostly, yes.
But, and there's even a difference in Louisiana among Louisianians because people in North Louisiana might be inclined to say Louisiana as well, but it is Louisiana.
And you've been saying New Orleans.
Right. So New Orleans is pronounced differently by everybody, and you can almost tell what ward you grew up in by how you pronounce it. But the way I pronounce it is basically saying New Orleans very fast, so it's New Orleans.
Sandra, Indio, California.
Hi, Cokie Roberts. Hi. You are a national treasure to our great country. I'm a 70-year-old senior citizen.
Listen, I'm older than you are. I'm older than you are, so stop with that senior citizen stuff.
God bless you. Please keep up your work. Your voice is soft and genteelly assured. We need you.
Well, aren't you kind? Thank you very, very much. I appreciate that.
So, Cokie Roberts,
I look forward to getting your last book.
Great. Please do.
Cokie Roberts, do you like the public attention? Maybe like isn't the right word. Are you used to not being able to go out in public without people stopping you?
But people are kind. People are very kind. And the people who don't like me don't come up and say anything, I'm happy to say. So I can hardly be resentful of that. And I'll tell you, Peter, when it was really important was after it was public that I had breast cancer. And at first I found it somewhat off-putting that people would come up and talk to me about it. And then I thought, you jerk. You know, here are people offering you their goodwill, their prayers, their concern, and their noisy machines. And I then realized that I was really cushioned by them. And it was a wonderful support system of strangers.
Kent in Irving, Texas, please go ahead.
Cokie, I really enjoyed the work.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for upholding your family values.
Thank you.
It means a lot to me. And I'm sorry for your losses in your family. But I did want to ask you, a common thread in our political structure that causes the biggest problems is the money. There's no way that all these candidates are spending this much money on their campaigns. I mean, we'd be making trillionaires overnight through airtime and newspaper ads. It's just bribery.
Well,
to not name it.
I agree that money is a huge issue in politics, as I said earlier. But the one thing to keep in mind is that people who spend a great deal of money often lose. I mean, let me introduce you to Steve Forbes. Let me introduce you to Ross Perot. It's not dispositive. It's a very heavy thumb on the scale, but it doesn't necessarily tip the scale. And I think that's something that is worth keeping in mind.
Stephen, Decatur, Illinois. We are talking with author and commentator Cokie Roberts. Hi, Stephen.
Hello, good day. And, I don't necessarily consider Cokie a national treasure. To me, she was always a straight talker, someone that was very charming. I could get the facts, and that was very charming. I heard a story that you told about your husband. He was up taking care of the guests while you were taking care of the furnace, and you started thinking of, I think you started thinking about divorce. But you obviously love him, and it didn't matter.
That's a true story. It was actually him and the landlord. It was even worse than a guest. He and the landlord. We were living in Greece, and he and the landlord are sitting in the living room together having a drink while I'm in the basement fixing the furnace. There was something wrong with that picture.
What is Steve Roberts doing today?
Steve is a full professor at George Washington University, where he is a wonderful, wonderful, gifted teacher. He not only is terrific in his coursework, but he takes great care of these students, gets them all jobs, gets them all married, all of that. He's also a regular commentator on ABC Radio and writes a weekly column that's syndicated around the country, and writes a column for Bethesda Magazine, so he's busy.
After the New York Times, he went to U.S. News, right?
Yes,
U.S. News and World Report for a long time?
Yeah, for about 10 years, I think. And then Steve Trachtenberg, then the president of GW, said the magic words, endowed chair, and because he had been an adjunct there and loved it. But then when he actually was offered the full professorship, that was something he jumped at.
Well, the way From This Day Forward is written, you're pretty frank in there about when you became more prominent, at least your face, and being more well known than he, and what that did to your marriage, or what it didn't do to your marriage.
Well, some men would not be able to deal with that, and particularly of our generation. We weren't raised expecting that, and all of the young men, that I knew in those years, they all expected to be at least president of the United States, and so to have and we women didn't expect to do anything. So the tables turned on us a great deal. We've really had to go through a lot of changes in society and in our own lives. And luckily for us, we, even though we met very, very young, we've been able to manage those shoals together and very lovingly. I don't mean that every day has been perfect, but we've been married now 49 years, and it's an awfully nice thing.
Text message from Barbara Bear in Kansas City, Missouri. Long admired you, insightful observer of people and the world of politics. Your historical research and writing is remarkable, but I would enjoy reading your eyewitness account to the years you've had a front row seat to modern history in the moment. Any chance?
No. No, first of all, I feel like I do that all the time. I comment on and write about what I've seen. But secondly, it's really nice to write about dead people. They cannot argue with you. Now, every so often, one of the descendants will. I had a descendant come up and give me grief not too long ago about one of the women in my books, and I basically said to her, "Give it a rest. She's been dead for hundreds of years." But no. But also, I do think it's really important to bring this history to life. I just think, Steve says that I'm on a mission, and he's right. I am on a mission. I'm on a mission to let Americans know about the women in our history. First to learn about it myself, but then second to let Americans know about it, because I think it's really important.
Anna is in Irving, Texas. Anna, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2 with author Cokie Roberts.
Another Irving, Texas.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi.
I enjoy C-SPAN, and Ms. Roberts, I've enjoyed your books and your work on ABC and on NPR. And I would like to ask, similar to the ladies that you write about, do you feel like you have been able to take advantage of the opportunities you've been given in journalism and becoming an author and also a historian, or have you been able to actually shape those opportunities yourself? And also, what do you think about statehood for Washington, D.C.? Thank you.
Yes, I think I've been very blessed. I mean, really, think of it. I was blessed to be born into the family that I was born into and have the education that I had and marry the man that I have, and I've got healthy children and grandchildren. You know, it's been a really a series of gifts, and to the degree that I've been able to make a success of it, of course, I've been able to take advantage of it, and I've tried very hard to pass along that to other people, especially to mentor young women and along the way. So I understand that I have been given many, many great gifts, and that none of this happens to everybody, and that this is something that I have an obligation to share and to do my best to make better for other people. And DC statehood is kind of part of that, isn't it? That there's a question of representation and ability to make life better for the people living in the District of Columbia. I think most of the country really doesn't understand that the people who live here in Washington, D.C. do not have equal representation in the United States government. You know, it's gotten better over the years in terms of voting for president and home rule and all of that, but it's still there's not equal representation in the United States Congress, and you know, that's sort of fundamentally undemocratic.
The dedication in capital dames. Because I write about women, I have dedicated my books to them, but I realize that I wouldn't have been able to write these books without the men in my life having taken me seriously first as a girl and then as a woman. So it is those men, 3 of whom we lost last year, I thank with this book. My father, Hale Boggs, my brother, Tom Boggs, my brother-in-law, Mark Roberts, my brother-in-law, Paul Sigmund, and most especially my husband, Stephen Roberts.
It was a very hard year last year. Steve's twin brother, Mark, dropped dead in July, and my brother, Tom, dropped dead in September.
Both unexpectedly.
Both totally unexpectedly. My brother-in-law, Paul, my sister's husband, was older and was sick, but also died last year, and a couple of good friends. So it was a very rough year. But at least I was able to thank them publicly.
Marcia, Maroa, Illinois.
Hello. I was wondering, I loved your books, Founding Mothers and Capital Dames.
Good, thank you.
And I was wondering if you'd ever considered about writing some of the women that helped settle the West, like Elizabeth Bacon Custer and Jessie Benton Fremont. And I've been reading the diaries of the books on William and
Lewis and Clark?
Lewis and Clark, yes. And I was wondering, do you think William Clark was in love with Sacagawea?
Yes, absolutely I do.
Hey, Marcia, stay on the line for a minute, and we'll get an answer from Cokie Roberts. But Marcia, what do you do in Maroa, and where does why the interest in what you've talked about?
Well, I live in Maroa, Illinois, which is a very small farming community, and I farm. I raise cattle by myself.
Great. Wow.
And I have always had a big interest in American history, even before America was a nation. And I've especially been interested in anything to do with the West.
Well, I can understand that if you're farming and raising cattle by yourself. Good question, Peter. So you're a pioneer woman yourself. Jessie Benton Fremont, I do write a lot about in Capital Dames, and she was quite quite an interesting person. She was the most famous woman in America in 1856 when her husband was running for president. But then she had a hard life and did, as you know, end up in the West, where the women of Los Angeles bought her house and made it possible for her to really live out her life with dignity. But I do think the Western women's stories are fascinating. The Mormon women who walked across the country, all of that, those are just incredible stories. I'm more comfortable writing about Washington just because I think that I bring a certain sensibility to that, so that if I can combine women's history and political history, I think it kind of works in my books. But there have been some terrific books about women of the West, and I do think William Clark was in love with Sacagawea, and I think she was probably in love with him too. In that Christmas when they were in the far West, when they were in what now is Oregon, she found a way to give him some small present, and that was really hard for her to do. And at the end of the trip, and her husband was a jerk, and at the end of the trip, Clark did write that she deserved a much greater reward. Now, she got no reward, so she clearly deserved a greater one than she was able to give. And he then did want to adopt, really, her baby, and she said, well, I'm still nursing him. And so the way she worked it out was, instead of letting him bring the baby to St. Louis, she moved to St. Louis with her husband. And so Clark did educate the boy, and but she was there too. So, you know, whether anything came of it or not, I would doubt it, given the time and all of that. But did they have more than a passing affection for each other? My guess is yes.
Now, Marcia, tell you what, we have an extra copy of Capital Dames here. You send your address to booktv@cspan.org, and we will get Cokie Roberts to sign this book after the show, and we'll send it out to you from Book TV. So that's for Marcia in Maroa, Illinois. Again, just send your address, if you want to booktv@cspan.org, and we'll get Cokie Roberts to sign it for you. Richard in Denver. Hi, Richard.
Hi. Hey, I was wondering just a couple of things. What your thought would be on presidents. The old adage is that anybody can be president, and apparently it doesn't apply too well at the current Republican Party. And then the other thing is, I was wondering what your opinion of states having the right to determine the abortion decision. Just two little quick comments, if you would.
Well, I'll start with the second one first because it's easier. States were in charge of abortion until the Supreme Court decision of Roe versus Wade in 1972. But once the court said that abortion before a certain period was unconstitutional, then it moves out of the realm of the states. Now the states can pass laws that limit abortions, can require things like parental consent for minors having abortions, that kind of thing. But they can't absolutely outlaw them under the Constitution the way it now stands, unless another case goes to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court reverses Roe versus Wade. And the other question was,
I apologize. It's my fault. I did not write it down, and I apologize to that gentleman in Denver. But this is from Bob in Duluth, Minnesota. Would you consider Alice Roosevelt Longworth's group a salon? Did you ever meet her?
I did meet her because her granddaughter was at school with me when I was at Stone Ridge here in Washington. Her daughter had tragically committed suicide, and her granddaughter, Joanna Sturm, was a couple of classes behind me at Stone Ridge. And Mrs. Longworth came in her limousine to pick up Joanna every day, and she was very dedicated grandmother. But she was also the character that you know her to be. You know, if you have nothing nice to say, come sit by me. But I think she had a very hard life, actually. I mean, her mother died when she was young. She grew up with this rowdy bunch of Roosevelt kids in the White House with a stepmother, and her husband, Nicholas Longworth, was awful. And so I think that, you know, and then she lost her daughter. So it wasn't an easy life, but she was a fascinating character.
There was a new book that came out, I think, this year, last year, about Alice Roosevelt Longworth and Eleanor Roosevelt and their relationship. Did you ever meet Eleanor Roosevelt?
I did meet Mrs. Roosevelt. Again, she was around in politics, you know, really when I was a young woman, and so through my parents' involvement in politics, I did have the opportunity to meet her.
Brad's in Minneapolis. Hi, Brad.
Hi there. Hi, Cokie.
Hi.
Hey, I don't know if you mentioned this earlier about your father. Can you just talk a little bit about what his feelings were about the findings of the Warren Commission? I've always heard that he had questions about it, and of course there's a conspiracy angle to it. That it was even tied to his plane going missing. If you could just mention that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
No, my father actually did not have questions about the Warren Commission, and that's something that's been spread around. But shortly before he died, he was asked about it and said that he was comfortable with the findings of the Warren Commission. And Jim Garrison, the person in New Orleans who had all the conspiracy theories, my father thought was completely crazy.
Carolyn, Wharton, Texas. Text. 3 parts to this question. How do you practice your Catholic faith in the very patriarchal Catholic religion? Is number 1.
Okay.
And as a feminist, how do you practice your faith? And then an unrelated question.
Okay. Well, you know, it is. I am Catholic like I breathe. So it's really impossible for me not to be Catholic. Now, does it make me furious, the patriarchy of the Church? Absolutely. And it makes me particularly furious on behalf of religious women, because there they are doing this incredible work. I'm talking about nuns, and really doing the work of Jesus. And the fact that they have to put up with men who can be really very appalling is something that just should not have to happen. Now, Pope Francis has helped along those lines a lot. And when he came to this country and made it very clear that he was very appreciative of the work that the nuns are doing, that was a very, very important step. And but he does understand that he doesn't understand women. It's clear. He makes that clear in his statements. So it's an issue. And if I were maybe a younger person or a person who had a sort of different upbringing in Catholicism, I probably would have. I might not be able to continue to practice as I do. But I'm too committed to it as a lifelong Catholic to be able to say goodbye to it, because it matters too much to me. And I do feel a sense of very strong sisterhood with the women religious. I'm in close touch with many of them. I'm so admiring of them and the work they do, and I feel like it would be abandoning them in some way. And also, it's my church. They can't run me out of it.
Was your mother the first female ambassador to the?
Yes, she was.
To the Vatican?
Yes.
Was that important at the time? Was that significant?
She was worried that it might be an issue, but it really wasn't. And my mother was a really world-class diplomat. She had been that her whole life, but then she was officially it. And really the encomiums that came in after she died from the diplomatic community were quite something. She also really understood certain important things about America that she was able to impart in Rome in ways that they could understand it, because she was a politician, and they're politicians, and so she was very, very effective.
Are Alice Roosevelt Longworth and Clare Boothe Luce, are they long-term historical figures like some of the women you've written about in Capital Dames?
Well, certainly Eleanor
Mothers?
Roosevelt is. I think that, and Clare Boothe Luce has her moment in history. I think Alice Longworth is more someone of a character. You know, there's a woman I write about in Ladies of Liberty, Betsy Bonaparte, who was a rich girl from Baltimore. Patterson was her maiden name, and she married Napoleon's younger brother when he came on a tour of the United States. And Napoleon quickly put an end to that, but she stayed a Bonaparte for life, and she was a character. And so she does come down in history because she was a character, and she did have letters. But and everybody else wrote about her, because she wore very see-through clothes and such things. In fact, at her wedding, one of the wedding guests said that what she was wearing would have fit in his pocket as a handkerchief. But Bishop Carroll married her, so it was she was somebody. Was she significant in terms of what she did? No, she was significant in terms of just giving us a good deal of entertainment.
John in Winfield, Alabama. Please go ahead with your question or comment.
Hey, thanks so much for taking my call down here in the woods of Alabama.
Where is Winfield?
Great fan of yours.
Where's Winfield?
Well, it's sort of in between Jasper, Alabama, and Tupelo, Mississippi.
Oh, okay, got it. Yep. Okay.
Kind of where that is.
I do. Yeah.
Big fan of yours. I used to listen to you on the way to teach school when I taught elementary school back in the 80s.
Good.
Did get to teach elementary histories, and so pleased with the children's book.
Thank you.
Just had one couple of questions I wanted to ask you. One was, in light of the fact that your family were very political, my dad was a mayor of my town, so I can kind of see similar things with it, both being Southern too, and Southern politics. So in light of the fact that they're very political, how has that shaped your views politically, and maybe given you a unique empathy for politicians?
I think that's it's a very good way of putting it. It has given me empathy for politicians. I know that they go home at night to rowdy households and homework and all of that, and that they are regular people who deal with regular issues, and here in Washington do it in a difficult financial situation because housing here is expensive, and they don't make as much as a lot of people in town. So I do have empathy for them, and as I said earlier, I do think that almost all of them are here to serve the public by their lights. And so I'm admiring of that. And I'm admiring of the fact that they are willing to be in the arena, to be ready to take on these issues of public policy where they can make a big difference in people's lives. So I do think that I do have a sense of understanding them.
Almost 3 hours we've sat here, and the words Hillary Clinton have not been uttered, which is kind of a little bit of a shock to me since we're talking about a lot of women in history.
I think that was that gentleman's other question, and I was just remembering it, where he said, can anybody grow up to be president, that business. And my reaction to that was, well, so far, anybody but a girl. And so I do think that, that moment is upon us, perhaps. Now, that's not going to decide the election, certainly, but I do think that there are people in the country who feel strongly that it is time, and I think Mrs. Clinton is playing on that this time around in a way she did not in 2008. Now it's a very different set of circumstances, but I do think that that's hanging there.
And in many ways, even if she didn't win, I mean, would she be seen as somebody who's important in history? Yeah. First Lady, Secretary of State, Senator?
I think she already is somebody important in history. Yes, absolutely. I think the combination of her various forms of service have already placed her in the history books.
Judy in Alexandria, Louisiana. Hi, Judy.
Ah, Alec.
Hi.
How are you?
Hi. Fine, thank you. My question is, what is your opinion of removing the Confederate memorials in New Orleans, like
Lee statue?
What is your opinion of removing those from the city of New Orleans?
Judy, what's your opinion?
It should not be removed because it's part of our history, not only of New Orleans, but of Louisiana and the South.
Cokie Roberts.
Well, you know, to me, it's kind of striking to think about Lee Circle without Lee. Now, I'm told it was called, I think, Tivoli Circle or something like that before that. But the mayor has said that he has really been struck by some of the things that the people on the city council have told him, and I think that makes a difference. And I've had other New Orleanians of color tell me that that when they were children, that they were really uncomfortable going around that statue. And again, remember, these are not things that date back to the war. These are things that are much more recent in our history. So again, now the Lee statue is somewhat complicated because it's on I think it's on the National Register of Historic Places. I'm not sure about that, but I think that's true, or a historic landmark or some such thing. I think it would make a certain amount of sense to have that be one of the monuments that does incorporate a lot of the history, whereas some of the others in New Orleans, I think, could go with no problem.
Tell us stories about David, Sam, and George of this week. This is Ron in Fargo, North Dakota.
Really, you know, one of the things that was so much fun about that program, first of all, we're all good friends, and we enjoy being with each other, and we traveled some, and that was always fun. But nobody was different off the air than on the air. So people who watched the program really did get a good sense of who we were or are. And it's not like there was some, wild and crazy George out there that was just waiting to get off the air, or some quiet and tame Sam that was waiting to get off the air. They are very smart, very interesting, very well-informed men who brought those attributes to television.
David in Pittsburgh, California. Please go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah, and I'll take it off the air after I ask her. I'm curious why we don't have debates like the Lincoln-Douglas debates during the 1850s and 60s and stuff like that. And the other question I have to ask you, most of your Republican-slated people that are running for presidents, I have a feeling they don't have a sense of what the history of this country is about, and I'd like to have your comments on that. Thank you very much. I'll take it off the air.
Lincoln-Douglas debates, Newt Gingrich tried to do them when he was running the last time, and I think he did get somebody to engage with him on them. But it's almost impossible to get Americans to watch debates that are broken up with questions that are an hour long. And getting people to sit down and actually pay attention to a very long disquisition where the two candidates are just talking to each other, I suspect the viewership on that would be about 3. And that's a shame, but I think that's the case. But every so often candidates try it, and that's kind of fun. But the Republicans, I don't think it's confined to the Republicans running for president who don't know our history. I've been wailing about that through this whole 3 hours of how much our history is not taught and how much it needs to be taught. And I think, there's one part that's a tiny advantage, which is in America, the fact that we don't know our history has a certain advantage, which is that we don't nurse these grudges as people do in other countries where they are willing to go to war with each other over something that happened 1,000 years ago among their ancestors. Fortunately, we don't do that. But on the other hand, we also don't know some of the really important parts about our history and about getting through periods of time when there were tremendous differences among us, and they were worked out legislatively and in ways that kept the country together, and done with the word compromise, which is something that, of course, has to happen if people are to come together. And to turn compromise into a dirty word is to have a recipe for total chaos, really, because you can't get anything done without somebody being willing to give a little bit here and take a little bit there.
Cokie Roberts, you talked about the updates that you're doing on a couple of your books and the new children's book. Is there another grand topic out there that you're looking at?
Yeah, there probably is. I'm not quite ready to talk about them yet, but I'm aware of the fact that the 100th anniversary of suffrage is in 2020. So that's something for me to be thinking about.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Book TV covered a book party for Capital Dames in May of this year when it first came out. I want to show you just a little piece of video and get your reaction to it.
This great mission, this great contribution that Cokie has discovered at this stage of her life, where she is rescuing the history everybody needs an editor. I just bring mine along. Or a producer, as the case may be.
That's my dear husband, Stephen. And it was at this stage of her life. I probably said something along the line of being old. But he's very kind about this work, because it really is not pleasant to be with me when I'm at the end of a book. And this book, because last year was rough, I was on horrible deadline, and in January I was getting up at 3 in the morning and writing straight through until 6:30 at night and Googling heart attack symptoms in women. And so it was, he really had to put up with a lot. And
were you really Googling that?
Yes, because the stress level was so high. And but he was, he's my biggest supporter by a long shot, and he was very sweet.
With everything that happened to you, did you consider delaying?
Well, except the sesquicentennial was going to be over in April of 2015, and I really wanted it to be in the stores while the sesquicentennial was still going on. So,
Bob is in Nashville. Bob, please go ahead.
Yes, Ms. Roberts, you are very much in the, very similar background to Tennessee's forgotten favorite son, Al Gore. Your parents both very much Southern progressives. Have you ever considered writing a book about your parents?
No, I really haven't, because, that's fraught to write a book about your parents. But my mother wrote a wonderful book called Washington Through a Purple Veil, about her own life, although, as she said later, think what a good book I could have written if I had been willing to tell the truth, meaning that, she doesn't tell tales out of school. But the Gores, particularly the women, Pauline Gore and my mother, were very good friends, and I've known Al Gore since the day he was born. And it is true that the families were similar in their politics.
The next call for Cokie Roberts comes from Rich in Lawrence, Kansas. Hi, Rich.
Hi. It's a really quick question. Have you ever had the urge during an interview with a politician to say, "Oh, come on now, you can't possibly believe that"?
Well, I've had the urge to say liar, liar, pants on fire, and I think I've actually said it. And I know I said to one once on the air, really what you're saying is basically clap if you believe in Tinkerbell. So I don't beat around the bush. But I haven't ever said you can't believe that, because that's not fair. They might actually believe it. You never know.
Yost, Las Vegas. Please go ahead with your question or comment for author and journalist Cokie Roberts.
Yes, Ms. Roberts. And first of all, thank you for taking the call. Always have been a great admirer of your commentaries on television. A question. I came here as an immigrant back in '62 from Holland and joined the United States Air Force. I'm a veteran, a Vietnam era veteran. One of the questions I've got, and since you've had that long perspective on American history and American politics, what bothers me personally is what I see as a crudification, a coarseness, an increasing tendency toward vulgarity in American culture and also in American politics. Is this something, in other words, which has happened many times before, or is this something, a trend, which is particularly disquieting? That is basically my question.
Well, we've certainly had very poisonous, partisan, polarized times before. But the vulgarity is something somewhat new. And I do think you're right that it permeates society. I mean, they're bumper stickers that have words that we would have to bleep on television on them. And when I was growing up, there was such censorship that books like Lady Chatterley's Lover were not allowed into the United States. And now that just seems quaint. So there certainly is a vulgarity in the music, in the way people talk, and of course that is bound to spill over into all aspects of life. And we're seeing now some of the candidates being celebrated for using vulgarity, and other candidates imitating them because they think maybe that'll make them look tough. It's something that I find very unpleasant. It's certainly the kind of thing that you raised your children not to do. And it is interesting. These words are still bleeped on television and radio, but used much more than they used to be, and I think that's too bad.
From Capitol Dames, not all of the entertaining in the Capitol was of the savory sort. Washington, where many married men lived without their wives, had long supported its bawdy houses. Now, with young single soldiers swarming into the city, the oldest profession thrived.
Indeed. Both black and white prostitutes by the thousands were in the city. And the most famous house was where the American Indian Museum is now, on the National Mall, Miss Hall's house. And she was, at one point, just as it is today, every so often the police would raid these places. And the trial, this is where newspapers are so wonderful, the trial was covered in great detail. And one of the young policemen said that he went in and he didn't see the women doing any work, meaning they weren't sewing or they weren't and he said, so I thought maybe a wedding was going on because they were serving champagne. And the chief says there was no wedding. But Miss Hall, even though she would occasionally get arrested, was considered such an upstanding citizen of the community. She died quite wealthy. And she has a big monument to her in that she put up herself, in Congressional Cemetery. And the newspaper stories about her upon her death were all about what a wonderful person she was and what a contributor to society. So there you go.
Congressional Cemetery is a little hidden treasure.
No, it's a wonderful place. My daughter worked there for a while doing the programs, but it tells a huge...
J. Edgar Hoover?
Well, my father has a cenotaph there. It's an empty tomb The story of those cenotaphs is all interesting too, because they were designed by Benjamin Latrobe, and who of course was the designer of much of Washington, and they were the places where members of Congress were basically stored until the weather was such that they could be taken back to their states to be buried. There was some consideration that the cenotaphs were so ugly that people avoided dying to stay out of them, but I don't think they're that bad. But the cemetery has many famous people buried there and many interesting stories.
From Ponchatoula, Louisiana.
Ponchatoula, I know it.
Dane Sherman. Can Ms. Roberts comment on whether she was surprised or not that Democrat John Bel Edwards won the Louisiana governorship? Does it mean something bigger for Louisiana and the South?
I was surprised because Louisiana has become such a red state, and no Democrat had been elected statewide in quite some time. And so the question is, was it just about David Vitter, the Republican candidate, and his problems? Or does it signify something bigger? And the answer is we really won't know until we go through a couple of more election cycles. What John Bel Edwards, the candidate who won, did do, aside from attack Vitter, which he did very effectively, he did reach out to lower-income white people about things like medical care and say he would expand Medicaid. And that he would raise the minimum wage. So whether those were issues that appealed to people and helped get him elected or not is really something we have to watch in another couple of cycles.
And Reverend Sabaj in Wichita, Kansas, apologize, sir, that offer for a signed book from Cokie Roberts was only for Marcia, who had called in earlier. So I apologize.
But if he writes to me at ABC, I'll send him a book plate.
There you go. There you go. Charlene's in Havre, Montana. Hi, Charlene.
Good afternoon. I've so appreciated listening to Cokie Roberts through the years, and your viewpoints have always been refreshing to me, whether I was feeding cows or getting ready to go to college as a non-traditional student in my 40s.
Good for you.
My question is, what do you think about Donald Trump digging up Ronald Reagan's theme, Make America Great Again? And then I have a follow-up. I'm concerned as a 62-year-old single woman. I'm looking at the federal budget, and I'm seeing on the news that entitlement programs and defense are about the same amount of money. And as a single white woman who all of white women, really, or any women really, who are single and who have cared for family members, I'm really concerned with what's going to happen between defense and entitlements, especially of women who live much longer than men. I will hang up and listen to your response.
Well, first of all, let me talk about Make America Great Again. I think America is great. I think it is a great country. And I think that if you ever want to feel, if you're ever doubting that, and you need to have your faith and affection for the country reinforced, all you have to do is go to a naturalization ceremony. And you see people from all over the world of every possible shape and hue raising their right hands to take the oath as citizens of the United States, and talk to them about why they're doing it. And it is, I can't even say this without having goosebumps all over me. And when I'm at one of the ceremonies, I'm in tears the whole time. They're just so inspiring. I'll just tell you one little brief one. A woman from Ethiopia, when I asked her why she was doing this, she said, because America is so great, it always is there when other people need her. And that's why it's been given so many blessings, and I wanted to be part of the blessing. I mean, it's just beautiful. So I think this notion of make it great again is really insulting. I think that it is great, and that we should feel confident in our greatness and rejoice in it, and not shy away from our ability to do what needs to be done for people in the world. That's my basic reaction to that. And the other question was,
I think. You know what?
I keep missing if there's more than one question.
Usually,
I know, entitlements and defense. So here's the deal. Unlike what most people think is true about the federal budget, if we got rid of every single solitary thing in the budget, everything about agriculture, when you say you've been on a farm, everything about justice, shut down the Supreme Court, close down the Congress, turn the Capitol into condos, all of that, shut down the entire federal government with the exception of defense, Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt. You would still have a deficit. And so those are the big tickets. And if your concern is that the entitlements will go away, I would not be concerned about that. And the reason I would not be concerned about that is because people who care about Social Security and Medicare vote. And they vote on those issues. And it is my view that the Pentagon could be rubble around our ankles and there will still be Social Security and Medicare. And you know what? We want people to vote. So I don't think there's any problem with that. I think that if people have a problem with that, then they should get out and vote on the issues they care about and organize around those issues and put together coalitions on those issues. But right now, it is still true that the most powerful lobbying group here in Washington is the elderly. And it's not about money. Old people, I'm one of them, are tight. But it is about voting, and I wouldn't worry about those entitlements as long as that vote remains as strong as it is.
What do you think about the fact that the New York Times put an editorial on the front page?
I thought it was very interesting. I hadn't realized they hadn't done that since 1920.
And Warren Harding, they were protesting at the time.
And Warren Harding, there were reasons to protest. But Florence was also a piece of work. But the issue of gun violence is one that I think has, people very, very upset on both sides. I mean, the fact that you had Jerry Falwell Jr. saying yesterday that the students at his university should arm themselves, is really something shocking to me. I have to say that, my kind of reaction to that is it becomes the shootout at the OK Corral. I don't want to be someplace where everybody's got a gun. It scares the devil out of me. And, I'd prefer for people to be yelling and screaming at each other, but not shooting at each other if somebody, is angry about something or somebody just goes nuts. And that's, the notion that everybody in the room has a gun is really scary to me.
Back to the Civil War era of our nation, Capitol dames.
When they did all have guns. In fact, Abigail Brooks Adams, the wife of Charles Francis Adams, wrote right before the Civil War in the Congress that did secede, she said, everyone is carrying arms. She says the other side puts their hands to their breasts at the least provocation. So it was a little scary.
Well, many of the women who remained in the capital city turned cold shoulders to the new First Lady, choosing not to call on her at Willard's Hotel before the inauguration, as protocol expected.
Well, Mary Lincoln was a very difficult person, but she also came into a very difficult situation. As I said earlier, Maryland and Virginia, Lincoln got 2% of the vote one place and 3% the other, something like that. So they were not welcoming. And there was an assumption that she was a coarse Westerner, that she did not have the manners and the refinement, these are the words that would be used, of the women who were here. That was wrong. That was entirely wrong. She had a very similar upbringing and education as many of the women who were here. She had been raised in Kentucky, and she was related to quite a few of them. But that was the expectation. Harriet Lane, who had served as First Lady under President Buchanan, the outgoing mistress of the White House.
Very popular, right?
Well, very popular. Wrote to a friend to that effect. They say Mrs. Lincoln is very coarse. So she came in with a lot of prejudice against her to begin with, but then she did not make it easy for herself. She was probably bipolar, and she could go off in fits of temper and say exactly what she thought about someone, and she was really addicted to shopping, and she would really go way beyond her budget, and the newspapers covered it all. So they, would follow her from store to store as she bought 300 pairs of gloves, and so she became a very difficult person to get along with.
Well, Cokie Roberts, what I hadn't realized was when her son had her committed, she got out, and her attorney was a woman lawyer.
Right, right. Robert Lincoln did have her committed, and who can blame him? I mean, she was at this point really off the charts, but he also was embarrassed by her, and I think that he thought she was hurting his career, so that wasn't very nice either.
All right, a few minutes left with our guest, Cokie Roberts, on In Depth. Maureen, Plainville, Kansas. Hi, Maureen.
Hi.
Hi.
We're listening.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to tell Cokie that I was a former director at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas for a decade, and your name was one of the first names that I heard when I moved to Dallas, and you are such an inspiration to so many women and continue to be, and I was really excited to see you on Book TV on C-SPAN today.
Well, that's very nice of you.
Maureen, you said her name was one of the first. Why?
Pardon? One of the first people in Dallas, because she was working on a paper and wrote many, many things often about women, and she also spoke at many library functions all over the city, and we had her at our Friends Association meetings several times, as well as we built a women's studies collection in the DeGolyer Library at SMU, and she visited with us there many times as well and played a role in helping us find women to get their papers and letters to put in that collection. And I wanted to thank her for that and for being an inspiration to me as well.
Well, thank you.
By giving me names of many, many women to put in that collection.
I appreciate that. I've very much enjoyed my time at SMU. It's a fascinating place.
How often?
And now, of course, President Bush has his library there, and it is terrific. The Bush 43 Presidential
Designed by
Library.
Laura Bush.
Well, she is, of course, spectacular, and the library is a very interesting place.
Yeah, she
was right in there.
Yeah. How often do you get invited to speak? Still,
quite often. I don't do it all the time, but quite often, yes.
Well, Marshall tweets into you. Do you have advice for authors of history?
Well, my main advice would be to go for it, because it can be frustrating, and you can come up against stone walls and try to figure out how to get around it. And sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just have to not go down that path. But my main message would be just keep at it. And there are so many more resources now. I was talking earlier about the newspapers. Harper's has all of its old issues around. And then the university libraries and the historic societies have become far, far, far more receptive to requests from people who are not official scholars. And they are very, very helpful.
Is the Library of Congress?
Oh, the Library of Congress is wonderful. I mean,
is that open to the public?
Oh, yes, of course it is. It belongs to us. It's our library. And the manuscript room, which is in the Madison building, has some just wonderful, wonderful helpers who are very knowledgeable working there.
And Cokie Roberts, by the way, the Library of Congress sponsors the National Book Festival every year. Cokie Roberts spoke about Capital Dames at that festival this past Labor Day weekend. If you go to booktv.org and you type in Cokie Roberts and book, you'll be able to see the book party, and you'll be able to see her presentation at the National Book Festival. Plus, in about an hour or two, you'll be able to see this program, which will be archived on Book TV's website as well. Again, booktv.org is our website. Just use that search function right there in the center and type in Cokie Roberts book, and you'll have a selection of programs to watch. Just a couple calls left. Carol in Florence, Kentucky. Please go ahead, Carol.
Hello, Cokie.
Hi.
I admire you so much.
Thank you.
I would like for you to speak about Sandra Day O'Connor, our first woman Supreme Court Justice. Thank you.
I think Sandra Day O'Connor is a very, very important figure in our history. Being the first woman on the Supreme Court, she really did pave the way for all who have followed her. And you know, there's a new book out about her relationship with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which I think is well worth reading. But she brought a sensibility, and this is something that is so important. When a woman is the first or the only in a place, she brings not just her knowledge and her intelligence and all of that, she brings a different sensibility to the table. And it's the experience of womanhood. And that's just something nobody else in the room has. And she certainly brought that to the court. I must say she also brought another very important element, which is now completely absent from the court, which was that of a legislator. And so she had the practical experience of actually having to carry out the dicta of the courts in a legislative body. And she brought that experience to her decision-making as well. And I think that's sorely missing at the moment, frankly. But she was and is a highly important person. She's been very involved in civic education since she left the court. And she's someone who will certainly go down in history as not just a first, but a major character.
Cokie Roberts joined NPR in 1978, joined ABC in 1988, co-hosted This Week with Sam Donaldson from 1996 to 2002. Still writing the national syndicated column with Steve Roberts?
Yes, Steve writes it most weeks, if the truth be told. I write it when I'm mad about something.
Crane in Folsom, Louisiana. I think you have about 30 seconds before we have to close this up.
I know Folsom.
Thank you very much for taking my call, C-SPAN. Ms. Roberts, big fan of yours. Real quick, what do you think about a lot of noise, but not a lot of content coming out of candidate Donald Trump? I'm a little worried about that. Your thoughts? I'll take.
Well, I've talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think the thing to do is wait and see what happens when people start voting. I have a good bit of faith in the American voter. And I think that if they decide that Donald Trump is the right nominee for the Republican Party, I think that you might start to see him moderate somewhat in his language. But it's also possible that they will not, once the voting begins, decide that he is the right nominee for the Republican Party. Voting begins February 1st in the Iowa caucuses. I'm sure C-SPAN will be there. And so we'll know soon how this starts to shake itself out.
And here are the books that Cokie Roberts has written over the years. First one, We Are Our Mother's Daughters. That's been updated since 1998 when it first came out. From This Day Forward with her husband Steve Roberts was her second book. Founding Mothers is another one. And Ladies of Liberty, out in 2004, I believe it was, or 2008. Haggadah, Cokie and Steve Roberts, about their interfaith marriage. And here is Founding Mothers, the children's book. And in the last couple of years, last year, Capital Dames by Cokie Roberts, about Civil War women. Thanks for the last 3 hours.
So good to be with you, Peter. Thank you so much. And thank you to your very kind viewers.
C-SPAN, created